There is a particular kind of silence that settles over water, a stillness that seems to hold memory in suspension, and tonight I find myself drawn to the edges of harbors long forgotten, to the wooden flanks of vessels that once carved pathways through unknown seas, carrying with them the weight of nations and the dreams of those who believed that wind and canvas could reshape the world. The story of the warship under sail is not merely a chronicle of battles won or lost. It is something far more intricate, a meditation on human ingenuity meeting the elemental forces of ocean and atmosphere, of timber and iron, shaped by hands that understood the language of currents and the geometry of wind. And as I stand here in imagination, watching the tide lap against ancient stone quays, I can almost hear the creak of oak beneath the strain of rigging, the whisper of canvas filling with purpose. These vessels were not born fully formed. They emerged gradually from the collective wisdom of shipwrights and sailors, from centuries of trial and terrible error, from the realization that the sea demanded respect in the form of careful calculation. Every plank fitted with precision, every spar positioned according to principles learned through observation and occasionally through catastrophe. The earliest warships under sail were hardly distinguishable from their merchant cousins, simple vessels with a single square sail, propelled as much by oars as by wind, moving along coastlines where the land remained visible, a reassuring presence against the vastness of water. But somewhere in the accumulated experience of Mediterranean sailors, in the minds of Phoenician and Greek and Roman builders, there emerged an understanding that a ship designed for conflict required different proportions, a different relationship between length and beam, between freeboard and draft. And so the evolution began slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, modifications made in response to specific challenges, a need for greater stability when carrying soldiers, a requirement for elevated platforms from which archers could command the deck of an enemy vessel, adjustments to the hull shape that might provide an advantage in ramming or in evading the ram of another, each change representing a small victory of design over circumstance. I imagine the shipyards of ancient ports, the smell of fresh-cut cedar and pine, the sound of adzes shaping timbers into curves that would cradle the ambitions of admirals. And I think about the knowledge held in the minds of master builders, knowledge that was seldom written down, passed instead from craftsman to apprentice through demonstration and correction, through the placement of a hand on a beam to test its soundness, through the careful observation of how a finished hull sat in the water. The transition from oared galley to sailing warship was neither swift nor simple. For centuries the two principles coexisted, oars providing reliability and control in calm conditions or in the narrow waters of harbors and straits, sails offering efficiency across open water when the wind proved favorable, and the challenge facing designers was to find the proper balance to create a vessel that could function effectively under both modes of propulsion without compromising either. By the time the medieval period arrived, bringing with it new patterns of trade and conflict, the sailing ship had begun to assert its dominance in northern waters, where different conditions demanded different solutions. The Atlantic and the North Sea were not the Mediterranean. Their waves ran higher, their winds blew with greater force and less predictability, and the vessels that emerged from Scandinavian and later from English and Dutch and French traditions reflected this harsher reality. The cog, that sturdy merchant vessel of the Hanseatic traders, possessed a deep hull and high sides, a single square sail on a central mast, and while it was built primarily for commerce, it could be converted readily for war, its elevated castles at bow and stern providing platforms for soldiers and for the mounting of early artillery. And in this adaptability, we see the practical nature of maritime development, the recognition that a ship represented too great an investment to serve only a single purpose. But as cannon grew more powerful and more numerous, as the nature of naval warfare shifted from boarding actions to artillery duels conducted at ever-increasing ranges, the requirements changed again, and the warship began its transformation into something more specialized, more deadly, and ultimately more beautiful in its terrible efficiency. Tonight, as I consider these vessels in the abstract, I am struck by the patience required in their construction. A ship of the line might take years to build, consuming the timber of entire forests, requiring the labor of hundreds of skilled workers, and all of this effort directed toward the creation of something that might serve for decades, or might be shattered in a single afternoon of battle, reduced to drifting wreckage and the cries of drowning men. Yet they were built nonetheless, generation after generation, each one incorporating lessons learned from its predecessors, each representing the state of knowledge at a particular moment, frozen in wood and rope and canvas, a snapshot of human understanding about the relationship between physics and victory. The transformation I speak of did not happen overnight. It unfolded across centuries. And to understand the warship in its maturity, we must first return to those early experiments, to the moment when sailors began to grasp that the wind itself could become a weapon, that the ability to maneuver, to approach or withdraw at will, could determine the outcome of an encounter as surely as the courage of any crew. In the Mediterranean world of the 15th century, the galley still reigned supreme, its banks of oars pulling it through calm waters with precision, its ram cutting through the waves toward enemy vessels. But already the limitations were becoming apparent. A galley required enormous crews, sometimes 200 men or more, most of them chained to their benches, pulling in rhythm to the beat of a drum. And these men needed food and water. They grew exhausted, they fell ill, and the galley's range was constrained by their endurance. The sailing ship, by contrast, required far fewer hands. Perhaps 40 or 50 men could manage a vessel of comparable size, and these men could rest in shifts, could maintain their effectiveness over voyages that stretched for weeks rather than days. The wind asked nothing, demanded no payment, required no sustenance. It simply was. And those who learned to harness it gained a profound advantage. Venice and Genoa, those maritime republics whose wealth derived from controlling trade routes, began to experiment with hybrid designs. Galleys equipped with auxiliary sails, vessels that could row when necessary but could also spread canvas when favorable winds appeared. And in these awkward compromises we see the conservative nature of naval innovation, the reluctance to abandon proven methods even as new possibilities emerged. But in the Atlantic ports, where merchants ventured farther from shore, where voyages to England or Flanders or the Baltic meant days out of sight of land, the sailing ship had already proven itself. The Venetian great galleys that made the annual Flanders voyage were in fact more ship than galley, depending primarily on their sails, using oars only for maneuvering in harbors or in moments of crisis. The crucial innovation, the development that would eventually revolutionize naval warfare, came from an unexpected direction, from the marriage of sailing ship and gunpowder artillery. And this union was not immediate or obvious. The first cannons mounted on ships were small affairs, positioned in the castles, firing over the rails, more useful for intimidation than for actual destruction. These early guns, cast in bronze or built up from iron staves like barrels, were temperamental devices. They exploded as often as they fired successfully. They required elaborate preparations, the careful measurement of powder, the ramming home of wadding and shot, and their accuracy was such that hitting a target beyond point-blank range was largely a matter of fortune rather than skill. Yet even these primitive weapons changed the calculus of naval combat. A ship equipped with cannon could damage an opponent before the vessels came together, could shatter oars, could kill rowers, could create chaos on an enemy deck. And this meant that the approach to battle, the closing phase that had once been a matter of mere seamanship, now became fraught with danger. The Portuguese were among the first to grasp the implications. Their caravels and carracks, venturing down the coast of Africa in the service of Prince Henry, encountered vessels from cultures with different maritime traditions. Arab dhows, African craft, and the Portuguese discovered that even a few small cannon, properly employed, could overcome numerical superiority, could cow opposition through the shock of explosive force. By the late 1400s, by the time Christopher Columbus sailed westward with his trio of small ships, the idea of the armed merchant vessel had become commonplace. His Santa Maria and her consorts carried bombards and falconets, not for naval combat, but for intimidating coastal populations, for announcing European presence with thunder and smoke. But the true weaponization of the sailing ship, the moment when it became a purpose-built instrument of war rather than a merchant vessel with guns strapped to its rails, this transformation required a conceptual leap. It required someone to imagine a ship designed from the keel upward, to carry heavy artillery, to absorb the recoil of repeated firing, to provide stable platforms for gunners, and to remain seaworthy despite the enormous weight of iron and bronze. The answer came in the form of the gunport, a simple innovation whose consequences echoed through centuries. Someone, and history does not record with certainty, who realized that cannon could be mounted lower in the hull, closer to the waterline, where their weight would contribute to stability rather than threatening to capsize the vessel, and that rectangular openings could be cut in the ship's side, fitted with hinged covers, allowing the guns to fire outward while keeping the sea from flooding inward. This innovation, attributed variously to French or Breton shipwrights in the late 1400s or early 1500s, transformed the sailing warship from a platform for soldiers into an artillery vessel, a floating battery that could bring dozens of heavy guns to bear, that could stand off at distance and pound an opponent into submission without ever coming close enough for boarding. The first ships to fully embrace this concept appeared in the early years of the 16th century during the reign of Henry VIII of England, a king whose passion for naval power led him to commission vessels specifically designed for war. The Mary Rose, launched in 1511, carried heavy bronze cannon on her lower decks, firing through ports cut in her oak sides, and though she would meet a tragic end, capsizing in the Solent in 1545 with the loss of most of her crew. She represented a new category of warship. These early gun-armed ships were stocky vessels, their length perhaps 3 or 4 times their beam, built with massive frames and thick planking to withstand the stress of firing, their decks reinforced to carry the weight of guns that might weigh 2 or 3 tons apiece. And they rode low in the water, their gun ports sometimes only a few feet above the surface, which meant they could not safely fight in rough seas. The Spanish, building their empire across the Atlantic, developed their own variants. The galleon, a ship that combined the cargo capacity needed for transoceanic commerce with the armament required to defend against pirates and rivals. These vessels were narrower than the English ships, with a length-to-beam ratio of perhaps 5 or 6 to 1, which made them faster but less stable as gun platforms. And here we encounter one of the fundamental tensions in warship design, the competing demands of speed and firepower, of seaworthiness and stability. A narrow ship could sail faster and point closer to the wind, but it rolled more severely, making gunnery difficult. A beamy ship provided a steady platform, but sacrificed speed and maneuverability. And every navy, had to choose where to strike this balance. The 16th century became a laboratory of experimentation. English shipwrights, under the guidance of master builders like Matthew Baker, began to apply mathematical principles to hull design to calculate the relationships between displacement and carrying capacity, between sail area and speed. Baker's drawings, preserved in fragments, show sophisticated understanding of hydrodynamics, the realization that a ship moving through water creates resistance that varies with hull shape, and that this resistance could be minimized through careful attention to the underwater lines. The Spanish Armada of 1588, that massive fleet assembled to invade England, represented the culmination of these early developments. 130 ships, ranging from massive galleons carrying 50 guns or more to smaller pataches and zabras, and while the campaign ended in disaster for Spain, scattered by storms and English fire ships, the Armada demonstrated that naval warfare had entered a new age, an age in which fleets of specialized warships, rather than hastily armed merchantmen, would contest for control of the seas. The English victory, achieved as much through superior seamanship and the weather as through actual combat, taught important lessons about ship design and naval tactics. The Spanish ships, built high with towering castles, proved difficult to maneuver and vulnerable to the wind, while the English vessels, lower and sleeker, could sail closer to the wind, could choose their moment of engagement, could dart into fire and then retreat before the Spanish could respond effectively. In the aftermath, European navies began to converge on certain principles. The realization that excessive height made ships unstable and hard to handle, that gun decks needed to be continuous, running the length of the ship rather than interrupted by internal structures, that the arrangement of masts and sails had to be carefully proportioned to provide balanced handling. These insights were won through experience and sometimes through tragedy, became the foundation for the next phase of development. The Dutch, emerging as a maritime power in their long struggle for independence from Spain, contributed their own innovations, Their flute or flyboat design, created for efficient cargo handling, influenced warship construction through its use of lighter scantlings and more scientific proportioning, and Dutch naval architects began to publish treatises on shipbuilding, attempting to codify the knowledge that had previously existed only in the minds of master craftsmen. By the early 1600s, the line of battleship, the vessel that would dominate naval warfare for the next 2.5 centuries, was beginning to take recognizable form, a ship carrying between 50 and 100 guns, arranged on 2 or 3 decks, with the heaviest pieces on the lowest deck, lighter guns above, and swivel guns and small cannon in the upper works, capable of delivering a broadside, the simultaneous discharge of all guns on one side that could shatter an opponent's hull or bring down masts and rigging with devastating effect. These broadsides, these simultaneous explosions of iron and fire, changed everything about naval combat. No longer did ships close to grapple and board. No longer did victory depend primarily on the courage of marines and the skill of swordsmen. Instead, fleets formed into lines, parallel columns of warships, each attempting to bring maximum firepower to bear while minimizing their own exposure, and the battle became a matter of gunnery, of loading and firing, of maintaining formation while wreathed in smoke and torn by splinters. The process of building such a vessel, a first-rate ship of the line, represented one of the most complex industrial undertakings of the 17th and 18th centuries. It began in the forests, where surveyors marked trees with the proper curves for frames, where timber cutters felled oak and elm and pine, where the wood was transported to seasoning yards to dry for years before use, because green timber, cut and shaped immediately, would twist and crack as it dried, rendering the ship weak and unreliable. The shipyard itself was a city within a city, saw pits, where teams of men worked in brutal rhythm, one above and one below, pulling great saws through massive logs, forges where iron work was hammered into shape, anchor smiths creating those crucial implements that might weigh several tons, rope walks stretching a quarter mile or more, where fibers of hemp were twisted and laid into cables strong enough to hold a ship against storm or current. At the heart of the yard stood the building slip, a sloped platform upon which the keel was laid, that central timber, the spine of the ship, sometimes a single piece of oak measuring over 100 feet in length, or more often assembled from several pieces scarfed together and fastened with bronze bolts. From this foundation everything else emerged, frames rising like ribs, shaped to create the hull's distinctive curves, wider at the water line, narrower at deck level, the tumble home that gave these ships their characteristic profile. The master shipwright moved among the work, checking alignments with practiced eye, ensuring that each frame stood perpendicular to the keel, that the spacing was exact, that the gentle upward curve from midships to bow and stern followed the proper arc. His knowledge was experiential rather than theoretical, though increasingly, by the 1700s, mathematical principles were being applied, treatises written, tables calculated, showing the relationships between displacement and sail area, between gun weight and stability. As the frames rose, planking was fitted, starting from the keel and working upward, each strake carefully shaped to follow the hull's curves, the planks fastened to the frames with tree nails, wooden pegs driven through holes and wedged tight, swelling when wet to create a bond stronger than nails or spikes, and between the planks, caulkers drove oakum, tarred rope fibers, into every seam, then sealed it with hot pitch, creating a barrier against the sea that would nonetheless require constant maintenance throughout the ship's life. Deck by deck the ship grew, the orlop deck lowest, barely above the waterline, where the cables and stores were kept, then the gun decks, 2 or 3 depending on the ship's rate, with massive beams to support the weight of artillery, the openings for gun ports cut through the planking, fitted with hinged lids that could be secured from inside, and above these fighting decks, the weather deck, the spar deck, where the ship's boats were stored and where sailors worked the rigging that controlled the vessel's movement. The construction of a first rate might consume 2,000 oak trees, each tree representing decades or even centuries of growth. The deforestation required to maintain a fleet of such ships was staggering, entire regions stripped of their timber, forcing navies to import from distant sources, the Baltic, the Americas, and to implement forest management programs designed to ensure supply for future generations, planting oak groves that would not reach maturity for a century. A long-term vision that speaks to the centrality of naval power in national strategy. While the hull took shape, rigging specialists prepared the masts. Enormous trees, pine or fir from northern forests, that would rise as much as 200 feet above the waterline when fully assembled. These were not single pieces. The lower masts might be single trees on smaller vessels, but the great ships required made masts, built up from multiple pieces bound together with iron hoops, creating composite structures that could withstand the enormous loads imposed by wind-filled canvas. Each mast carried multiple sections, the lower mast, the top mast above it, the top gallant mast higher still, and on the largest ships, even a royal mast reaching toward the sky. Each section held in place by complex arrangements of rope and wood, the tops, platforms at the junction points, serving as working positions for sailors and as mounting points for light guns during battle, and from these masts extended the yards, the horizontal spars from which the square sails hung, each yard carefully proportioned to its position, the longest at the level of the lower mast, progressively shorter above. The installation of the masts was a critical moment, massive sheer legs or floating cranes lifting these multi-ton assemblies, lowering them through the deck into the mast step, a massive block of wood at the keel level that would bear the compression forces, and once in place, the standing rigging was installed, the shrouds running from masthead to chain wales, providing lateral support, the stays running forward, preventing the mast from falling backward. All of this rigging carefully tensioned using deadeyes and lanyards, adjusted until the masts stood perfectly vertical, ready to receive the tremendous loads they would bear. The sail plan of a ship of the line was a marvel of balanced complexity. 20 to 30 individual sails, each cut to specific dimensions, each with its own name and purpose. The courses on the lower yards, massive rectangles of canvas that provided primary propulsion, the top sails above, the top gallants higher still, and triangular staysails filling the spaces between masts. Together these sails might total 40,000 square feet of canvas or more, an area exceeding an acre. And managing this expanse of fabric required hundreds of lines, each running through carefully positioned blocks, multiplying force so that a few men could control sails that weighed hundreds of pounds. The running rigging, the lines that controlled the sails and yards, was color-coded on many ships: white rope for one function, tarred rope for another, so that in darkness or in the confusion of battle, a sailor could identify the correct line by touch, and the arrangement of these lines followed strict conventions: halyards to raise yards, braces to swing them horizontally, sheets to control the lower corners of sails, each system duplicated across multiple masts, creating a pattern that, once learned, allowed a trained crew to perform complex maneuvers with minimal verbal communication. The gunnery, the very purpose of these vessels, required its own elaborate systems. The guns themselves were works of art, cast bronze pieces in the early period, later superseded by iron guns that were cheaper if less reliable. Each cannon was a unique object, cast in a mold, cooled slowly to prevent cracking, then bored out to create the smooth interior channel, tested by firing with progressively larger powder charges, and finally marked with the weight of shot it was designed to fire: a 24-pounder, a 32-pounder, a 42-pounder on the lower decks of the largest ships. These guns rested on wooden carriages, oak frames fitted with small wooden wheels called trucks, the whole assembly secured to the ship's side by breech ropes. Heavy lines that absorbed the recoil when the gun fired, allowing it to roll backward 6 or 8 feet, where the crew could reload it safely inboard before hauling it forward again with tackle to run it out through the port for the next shot. The process required a trained crew of perhaps 8 or 10 men per gun, working in practiced sequence, swabbing the barrel to extinguish sparks, loading powder charge, ramming home wadding and shot, priming the touch hole, and finally, at the command, applying the slow match to ignite the charge. The rate of fire was measured in minutes rather than seconds, perhaps 3 shots every 5 minutes from a well-trained crew, and accuracy was largely a function of range and timing. The gunner watched the roll of the ship, waiting for that moment when the deck reached the top of its arc, when the gun pointed level rather than up at sky or down at sea, and fired at that instant, hoping that in the second or two it took for the priming powder to flash through the touch hole and ignite the main charge, the aim would still be true. The shot itself came in various forms: solid iron balls for smashing through hulls, bar shot, 2 hemispheres connected by an iron bar, designed to spin through rigging and bring down masts, chain shot serving similar purpose, and at close range canister or grape, clusters of small balls that turned the cannon into a massive shotgun, devastating against personnel but useless against the structure of a ship. Each type of ammunition had its tactical application, its moment in the sequence of battle when it would be most effective. Below decks, the magazine was a carefully controlled space, lined with copper to prevent sparks, lit only by lanterns placed in sealed glazed alcoves. The light shining through, but the flame isolated from the explosive atmosphere. Here the gunner's mates measured out powder charges, filling flannel cartridges, while above them, in the heat of battle, ship's boys called powder monkeys ran these charges to the guns, a relay system designed to minimize the amount of explosive powder exposed on the gun decks at any moment. The cost of all this, the construction, the fitting out, the manning and provisioning, was staggering, A first-rate ship might cost as much as the annual revenue of a small nation, and maintaining a fleet of such vessels, keeping them in repair, replacing rigging and sails, storing naval provisions, paying the crews, this required an administrative apparatus, navy boards and victualling yards and rope walks and dry docks, an entire infrastructure dedicated to supporting these wooden weapons. And yet nations committed to this expense because control of the sea meant control of trade, meant the ability to protect merchant shipping while preying on enemy commerce, meant the capacity to project power across oceans, to defend colonies or to threaten enemy coasts. A fleet in being, even if it never fired a shot, altered the calculations of diplomats and generals, forced enemies to divert resources, to garrison ports that might otherwise be left vulnerable. The great naval powers of the 17th and 18th centuries, England and France and Spain and the Dutch Republic, were locked in a constant competition, a race to build more ships, better ships, to develop tactical innovations that might provide advantage in battle. The line of battle itself evolved from informal parallel sailing to rigid formations, ships precisely spaced, maintaining station despite wind and current, presenting a continuous wall of guns to the enemy while protecting each vessel's vulnerable bow and stern, breaking the enemy line, cutting through at a right angle to rake ships from bow to stern, where they could bring few guns to bear in response. This became the holy grail of naval tactics, but it required precise timing, exceptional seamanship, and often a willingness to accept damage in the approach. The annals of naval history record the rare instances when commanders successfully executed this maneuver. Rodney at the Battle of the Sands, Nelson at Trafalgar, moments when bold action and superior ship handling produced decisive results. The evolution of these tactics was inseparable from the evolution of the ships themselves. As naval architects refined their understanding of hydrodynamics and structural engineering, vessels became longer relative to their beam, improving speed and sailing qualities, the awkward proportions of earlier centuries. Ships that wallowed and struggled to make headway against contrary winds gave way to more elegant forms, hulls with finer entries and cleaner runs that sliced through water rather than pushing it aside. The science of hull design advanced through systematic observation and experimentation. Chapman in Sweden, Bouguer in France, Euler applying mathematical principles to naval architecture. These men and others began to understand that the resistance a ship experienced was not uniform, that friction along the hull surface was distinct from the wave-making resistance created by the bow pushing water aside, and that both could be minimized through careful attention to shape and proportion. Copper sheathing, introduced widely in the 1770s, transformed naval warfare by protecting hulls from the shipworm. The teredo navales that bored into underwater timbers, weakening them until they crumbled, and from the accumulation of marine growth, barnacles and weed that increased drag and reduced speed, a coppered ship could remain at sea for years, could sail faster even when months from the last careening, and this gave fleets equipped with copper bottoms a decisive advantage, the ability to maintain blockades, to remain on station through seasons when fouled ships would need to return to port for cleaning. But the introduction of copper brought unexpected consequences, galvanic corrosion where copper touched iron fastenings, requiring the development of copper bolts and eventually bronze fastenings, and the cost of sheathing an entire fleet, buying thousands of tons of copper, processing it into sheets, affixing it to hulls with thousands of nails. This represented yet another massive expense, another escalation in the naval arms race that defined the age. The peak of sailing warship development came in the early decades of the 1800s, the era of the Napoleonic Wars, when British and French shipyards produced vessels that represented the culmination of 3 centuries of refinement. Ships like HMS Victory, launched in 1765 and still serving as a flagship 40 years later at Trafalgar. 104 guns on 3 continuous decks, a crew of 800 men capable of delivering a broadside weighing half a ton of iron, and doing so every few minutes in the heat of battle. These late sailing warships incorporated countless small improvements, diagonal bracing in the hull structure, increasing rigidity and resistance to the racking stresses of heavy seas, iron knees replacing some wooden ones, providing stronger connections between beams and frames, improved pumps to handle the inevitable leaking, better steering gear allowing more precise control, each enhancement marginal on its own, but collectively transforming the capabilities and reliability of these vessels. The internal organization of these ships reflected decades of accumulated wisdom about how to sustain hundreds of men in wooden boxes for months at sea, the orlop divided into specialized spaces, the bread room for storing ship's biscuit in sealed containers, the spirit room for rum and wine, carefully locked and guarded, the cable tier where the massive anchor cables were coiled, the surgeon's cockpit, a space deep in the hull where wounded men would be treated during battle, chosen for its position below the waterline, where the surgeon and his mates would be protected from enemy fire while they amputated shattered limbs and extracted splinters by candlelight. The crew itself was a carefully structured society, the officers quartered in the stern, the wardroom where lieutenants and the master and the surgeon messed together, the captain's great cabin above, spanning the full width of the stern, with windows looking aft across the wake. These spaces were relatively spacious and well lit, furnished with some comfort, a stark contrast to the crew's quarters, where sailors slung their hammocks in the space between guns, sleeping in shifts because there was not room for all to rest simultaneously, eating from mess tables that hung from the deck beams and were struck and stowed when the drums beat to quarters. The daily routine aboard these ships followed patterns refined over generations. The division of time into watches, 4 hours on duty, 4 hours off, the whole day punctuated by bells struck every half hour, the maintenance that never ceased, holistening the decks to keep them clean and white, tarring rigging to protect it from rot, painting and varnishing woodwork, sail mending and rope splicing, the constant minor repairs that kept a ship functioning, because neglect compounded quickly, a small leak becoming a structural failure, a frayed line parting at a critical moment and bringing down a mast. And yet, even as these ships reached their zenith of development, even as captains and admirals had learned to wield them with extraordinary skill, the technology that would render them obsolete was already emerging. Steam power, demonstrated in experimental vessels in the late 1700s, developed for commercial application in the early 1800s, promised freedom from wind and current, the ability to move in any direction regardless of weather, to maintain schedule and position with a reliability that sail could never match. The navies of the world watched these developments with interest tinged with skepticism. Early steamships were slow and short-ranged, their paddle wheels vulnerable to gunfire, their bunkers filled with coal that displaced space for guns and provisions. They seemed suited to rivers and harbors, to towing sailing ships in calm conditions, but hardly fit for fleet actions or extended cruising. The sailing ship of the line still dominated, still represented the measure of naval power, and shipyards continued to lay down wooden walls, magnificent vessels that were already anachronisms at their launching. The transition came gradually, experimentally, steam and sail coexisting in hybrid forms, frigates with both masts and engines, capable of making passage under canvas, but able to maneuver in action using their screws for the screw propeller, replacing vulnerable paddle wheels, made steam propulsion viable for warships, tucking the mechanism below the waterline where it was protected from shot, and allowing guns to be mounted in traditional broadsides without interference from paddle boxes. Through the 1840s and 50s, naval architects struggled with the competing demands: how much weight to allocate to engines and fuel versus guns and ammunition, how to protect machinery from enemy fire, how to combine the tall masts needed for efficient sailing with the low profile desired to reduce target area. The resulting ships were often compromises that excelled at neither mode of propulsion, but they represented necessary steps in the evolution, the working out of problems through practical experience rather than theoretical analysis. The introduction of explosive shells rather than solid shot accelerated the obsolescence of wooden hulls. A solid cannonball might punch through oak planking, creating a clean hole that could be plugged, but an exploding shell shattered timbers, started fires, created wounds that could not easily be repaired. And when these shells were combined with rifled guns, with their superior range and accuracy, the wooden warship became suddenly vulnerable in ways that no amount of timber thickness could address. Iron construction, first attempted for merchant vessels, offered a solution. Iron plates could be thicker than wood without excessive weight, could be shaped in ways that timber could not, and most critically, could be armored. Additional layers of iron attached to create a barrier against shot and shell, the ironclad warship, demonstrated dramatically in the American Civil War when Monitor fought Virginia to a standstill, marked the beginning of the end for wooden sailing warships. Yet the pure sailing warship, without engines, continued to be built into the 1860s, smaller vessels, sloops and corvettes, serving on distant stations where coaling facilities did not exist, showing the flag in remote waters, protecting commerce in regions where speed was less important than endurance. These ships represented the final flowering of a tradition, beautiful in their anachronism, already nostalgic objects, even as they were launched. The last major fleet action fought entirely under sail occurred at Navarino in 1827, when British, French, and Russian squadrons destroyed a combined Turkish and Egyptian fleet, both sides relying on tactics and technology that Nelson would have recognized. Ships forming line, closing to point-blank range, battering each other with solid shot until one side or the other collapsed. It was a throwback, a final demonstration of principles that had governed naval warfare for 2 centuries, and within a generation it was as remote as the age of galleys. By the 1870s, the transition was complete in the world's major navies. The ships of the line were gone. scrapped or hulked or converted to training vessels, their guns removed, their masts sometimes cut down, their once proud hulls serving as storage or accommodation, ignominious ends for vessels that had represented the apex of maritime achievement and the men who had served in them. The last generation of officers who had learned their trade under sail alone were themselves becoming obsolete, their skills no longer relevant in an age of steam and steel. The knowledge they carried, the intuitive understanding of wind and sea, the ability to read weather and cloud formations and swell patterns, the skill to handle a square-rigged ship in all conditions, this began to fade, preserved imperfectly in training programs and manuals, but losing the living transmission that had sustained it for centuries. The young officers entering the Navy now learned engineering and gunnery, electricity and metallurgy. The sea was still their domain, but they approached it differently, as a medium to be conquered through technology rather than a force to be worked with through understanding and skill. And so the sailing warship passed into history, not with a dramatic ending, no final great battle, but through gradual obsolescence, through the relentless logic of technological advancement. The ships themselves mostly disappeared, broken up for their timber and metal, a few preserved as relics or memorials. HMS Victory at Portsmouth, USS Constitution in Boston, survivors of a vanished world, maintained at enormous expense as monuments to what had been, what remains beyond these few physical artifacts, is the influence these ships had on the nations that built them, the ways in which the demands of a naval power shaped economies and societies, drove innovation in manufacturing and finance, created global networks of supply and maintenance. The sailing warship required an industrial base, forests and foundries, rope walks and sail lofts, and the infrastructure built to support wooden navies. The dockyards and arsenals became the foundation for the steel navies that followed. The legacy extends beyond infrastructure and into the realm of thought. The way these ships shaped how nations conceived of power and security, how they understood their place in the world. A fleet represented something more than military capability. It was a statement of identity, a declaration that a nation commanded resources and knowledge sufficient to build and maintain these floating cities, that it possessed the organizational capacity to crew and provision them, the will to commit them to battle. The officers who commanded these vessels, particularly in the British Royal Navy, which maintained the largest fleet through the 18th and 19th centuries, formed a distinct social class. Men who entered service as boys of 12 or 13, midshipmen learning their trade through years of practical experience, studying navigation and seamanship and the manual of arms, advancing through examinations that tested not just theoretical knowledge, but practical skill, the ability to work a lunar observation, to con a ship through a difficult passage, to manage men under the stress of battle. These officers carried with them assumptions about hierarchy and duty, about the proper relationship between commander and commanded, that influenced institutions far beyond the Navy. The notion that authority must be earned through demonstrated competence, that leadership required both technical mastery and moral courage, that those in command bore absolute responsibility for outcomes. These principles, learned on the quarterdeck, shaped colonial administration and corporate governance, influenced how the English-speaking world organized itself, and the common sailors, the men who hauled on lines and manned the guns, who climbed ratlines in storms and endured months of salt provisions and stale water, they too shaped the culture of their time, and their skills were portable. A sailor trained on a warship could work merchant vessels, could navigate the world's oceans, and in port cities from London to Boston to Bombay. Maritime workers formed communities that transcended national boundaries, sharing a language of technical terms, a set of customs and traditions, a way of understanding the world through the lens of wind and tide. The literature of the age reflected the centrality of these ships. Naval fiction became a genre unto itself, from Tobias Smollett's accounts based on his own service, through Frederick Marryat, and eventually to the 20th century works of C.S. Forester and Patrick O'Brien, authors who captured not just the drama of battle, but the texture of daily life aboard, the creaking of timbers and the smell of tar, the peculiar society that existed in these wooden worlds, isolated from shore but connected to it through chains of command and supply that stretched across oceans. The terminology that evolved aboard sailing warships entered common language in ways we barely recognize. Learning the ropes, knowing the ropes, taking the wind out of someone's sails, 3 sheets to the wind, a square meal, showing one's true colors, phrases born from specific practices and conditions, from the hundreds of lines that controlled sails and yards, from the flags that identified nationality, from the daily rhythms of shipboard life, embedded now in speech so deeply that their origins are forgotten. The beauty of these vessels, the aesthetic dimension, deserves consideration beyond mere functionality, because the builders did not create purely utilitarian objects. Ships of the line were decorated, their sterns carved with elaborate scrollwork and painted in bright colors, their figureheads representing mythical creatures or national symbols or admirals, their guns often inscribed with names and mottos. There was pride in craftsmanship, a desire to create something that would endure not just physically, but in memory and reputation. The ship portraits painted by maritime artists, the Van de Veldes in the 17th century, Nicholas Pocock and Thomas Buttersworth later. These works documented specific vessels but also captured something of the sublime, the sense that these ships represented human achievement measured against the vastness of ocean and sky. A sailing warship under full canvas, heeled to the wind, its hull cutting through blue water, became an emblem of power and grace combined, of human will imposing order on elemental chaos. And in their final decades, as steam replaced sail, the sailing warship became an object of nostalgia, even for those who had never served aboard one, representing a lost world of craftsmanship and seamanship, a time when humans worked with natural forces rather than against them, when skill and experience mattered more than mechanical power. This romanticization overlooked the harsh realities, the brutal discipline, the disease and accidents, the short brutal battles that ended with decks slippery with blood. But it spoke to something genuine, a recognition that something of value was passing away. The knowledge required to build these ships, to sail them, to fight them effectively. This represented accumulated wisdom spanning generations. Master shipwrights who could judge by eye whether a frame was fair, sailmakers who understood how canvas must be cut to achieve the desired shape when filled with wind, gunners who knew by the feel of the breech whether a cannon had been properly cast. This expertise could not be quickly recreated once lost, and its passing marked a genuine impoverishment even as new capabilities emerged. Tonight, in imagination, I stand on the shore watching these vessels, not as they were in their final years, museum pieces and training hulks, but in their prime, a fleet at anchor, masts forming a forest of vertical lines against the sky, yards precisely aligned, ships riding to their anchors in perfect formation, the whole scene speaking of order and readiness, of power held in reserve but immediately available. And I think about what it meant to build such things, to commit such resources to objects that might serve for decades or might be destroyed in an afternoon. The courage required not just physical bravery in battle, but the intellectual courage to design and build according to principles that could only be proven through use, to commit a ship to the ocean knowing that every weakness in design or construction would be ruthlessly exposed. This was its own form of daring, and the thousands of men who worked in shipyards and rope walks, who felled timber and cast guns, who calculated tonnage and drew plans, they were as essential to naval power as the admirals who led fleets into action. And so we arrive at a point of reflection, looking back across centuries at these wooden vessels that shaped the world's political geography, that determined which languages would be spoken in distant lands, which legal systems would prevail, which cultures would dominate global commerce. The sailing warship was an instrument of empire, of conquest and control, but it was also a marvel of engineering, a synthesis of art and science, a testament to what humans could achieve when they combined systematic observation with practical skill. The silence settles again, that particular stillness of evening on the water, and the harbor is empty now, the great ships gone, their timbers rotted or burned or repurposed, their crews long since returned to dust, but the wake they left behind, the patterns they established, the ways they shaped how we think about power and organization and global connection, these remain invisible but pervasive, currents running beneath the surface of our world. I find myself thinking about the unnamed craftsmen, the men who shaped frames and caulked seams, who spliced rigging and stitched canvas, whose work had to be perfect because imperfection meant death, not for themselves necessarily, but for the sailors who would depend on their skill in storms or battle. There is something profound in this, in work done well, because it must be done well, because lives depend on it, and the sailing warship, in all its complexity, represented millions of such individual acts of careful craftsmanship, each one small, each one essential. The last light fades from the harbor, the water darkens from blue to gray to black, and somewhere in that darkness I imagine the ghosts of these vessels, not supernatural manifestations, but memory traces, the accumulated weight of all those voyages, all those battles, all these men who lived and died aboard ships that no longer exist except in paintings and models and written accounts. And I wonder what they would make of our world, our ships of steel driven by engines, our weapons that strike from beyond the horizon, our satellites that make navigation a matter of reading coordinates rather than shooting stars. Would they recognize what we have gained, the reliability and speed, the global communication, the ability to move goods and people with a certainty they could never have imagined? Or would they mourn what we have lost, the intimate knowledge of wind and current, the skills honed over years of practice? the particular satisfaction of bringing a ship safely to port through your own skill and that of your crew, working together with forces you could never control but could learn to use. These questions have no answers, or rather they have only the answers we choose to give them, and perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps the sailing warship exists best now as a provocation to thought, as a reminder that technological change brings both gain and loss, that what seems eternal and unchangeable in one age becomes quaint or obsolete in the next, and that the capabilities we prize today may seem as remote to future generations as the ability to take a lunar sight or splice an eye in a cable seems to us. The tide turns. I can hear the change in the rhythm of waves against stone, and in this sound, this eternal pulse that existed long before the first ship was built and will continue long after the last ship has vanished, there is a kind of comfort. The sea remains, indifferent to human purposes, and the story of the sailing warship is ultimately a chapter in the longer story of humanity's relationship with the ocean. Our attempts to master it, to use it, to survive upon it, attempts that continue in different forms, with different technologies, but driven by the same fundamental need to cross water, to connect with what lies beyond the horizon. And so the story comes to rest, like a ship finally reaching harbor after a long voyage. The anchor dropped, the sails furled, the deck quiet after weeks of wind and spray and endless motion. There is satisfaction in arrival, in having traversed the distance, in having weathered what storms came, and there is peace in stillness, in the gentle rock of a vessel secure in sheltered water, no longer pushing forward, no longer striving, simply being, simply resting, while the night deepens and the stars emerge, those same stars that guided navigators across centuries, constant and distant and utterly indifferent, beautiful in their remoteness, marking time in their slow wheeling across the darkness. The water laps softly against hulls that are no longer there, and the silence is complete. I walk through a realm where sand holds memory, where stone speaks in silence, and where the passage of thousands of years feels less like distance and more like depth. The Nile moves as it has always moved, a ribbon of silver-green cutting through ochre and gold, and along its banks the air shimmers with a heat that seems to come not just from the sun overhead, but from the earth itself, as if the ground remembers every footstep, every offering, every whispered prayer that has ever touched it. In the stillness before dawn, when the darkness hasn't yet surrendered to light, there exists a particular quality of anticipation. The desert sky holds its breath, and the stars appear closer than they do anywhere else, as if they too are watching, waiting for what the new day might reveal. The temples rise from the landscape like thoughts made solid, their massive columns casting shadows that stretch and shift with the sun's journey. And within those shadows, within the cool stone interiors, where sunlight enters only in calculated shafts, there lingers something that feels almost like presence, almost like the accumulated weight of devotion, of ritual, of belief, practiced so continuously for so long that it seemed to saturate the very walls. I find myself drawn to a particular doorway, its frame carved with images that flow into one another without clear beginning or end. Birds with human heads, figures bearing staffs and ankhs, processions that move eternally forward, yet somehow remain forever still, and the stone itself, smooth from centuries of hands, of fabric brushing past, of the quiet friction of daily reverence. Beyond the doorway, the light changes, becoming something softer, more diffuse, as if filtered through water or through the veil between what is seen and what is known. And in this altered luminosity, shapes resolve themselves slowly. A seated figure with the head of a jackal, a woman whose arms extend like wings, a man whose skin gleams with the blue-green of deep water. The air here carries a scent I cannot quite name, something of incense long since burned to nothing, something of oil pressed from flowers that may no longer grow, something of time itself, if time could be said to have a fragrance, dry and faintly sweet and impossibly ancient. On the walls, stories unfold in registers, horizontal bands of narrative that require the eye to move slowly, deliberately, from right to left, following journeys both earthly and celestial, and what emerges from these images is not chaos but order, not randomness but pattern, a universe understood as layers, as transformations, as cycles that turn and return like the wheel of stars overhead. There are jars here, sealed and labeled, containing substances whose purposes were recorded in scripts that flow like reeds bending in wind, and there are tools whose functions speak of care, of precision, of processes that could not be hurried, that required patience and timing and the kind of knowledge that gets transmitted not through books alone, but through demonstration, through apprenticeship, through the slow accumulation of understanding that comes only from repetition and attention. I notice the way the columns taper, the way the ceilings curve slightly, the way spaces are designed not just to enclose, but to direct, to guide the mind toward particular contemplations, particular orientations. And there is genius in this, a sophistication that reveals itself only gradually, only to those willing to stand still long enough to observe without rushing toward conclusion. The stone beneath my feet, worn smooth by centuries of processions, holds a coolness even in the day's heat, and walking upon it feels like moving through a text written in a language just beyond comprehension, where the meaning hovers at the edge of understanding, familiar yet foreign, accessible yet mysterious. In the distance, beyond the walls, the desert stretches in waves of dun and amber, an ocean of sand where the wind writes messages that erase themselves, where the horizon shimmers with mirages, and where the boundary between earth and sky becomes uncertain, becomes a place of merging, of transformation. And here, in this threshold, space between the monumental and the intimate, between the preserved and the lost, between what was and what remains, something whispers of a worldview so complete, so encompassing that it touched every aspect of existence, from the grandest cosmic principle down to the smallest daily gesture, from the movement of the sun across the sky to the preparation of bread, from the flooding of the river to the painting of a child's toy. This is where I begin, in this luminous quiet, among these patient stones, preparing to trace the contours of a vision that saw the visible and invisible as one continuous reality, that understood death not as ending but as doorway, that built eternity not in metaphor but in limestone and granite and gold. The beginning, if such a thing can be said to have a single point of origin, emerges from the mist of prehistory like islands appearing as floodwaters recede, And what we find in those earliest traces are not yet temples, not yet the grand cosmologies that would later crystallize into canonical form, but something more fundamental, more elemental, the first stirrings of pattern-seeking in a landscape that itself seemed to speak of cycles and returns. Before there was Egypt as a unified realm, before the double crown joined the red land and the black, there were communities scattered along the river's edge, and these communities, separated by desert and distance, each developed their own relationships with the forces that governed their existence, the sun that brought both life-giving warmth and deadly heat, the river that could nourish or destroy. The animals whose behavior seemed to follow laws both observable and mysterious. In the south, in the region that would become known as Upper Egypt, the people watched vultures circle in thermals above the cliffs and saw in these birds something of protection, something of maternal care in the way they tended their young. And so the vulture became associated with a goddess, with Nekhbet, whose wings would eventually spread across the brows of rulers, whose image would signify sovereignty over the southern lands. In the north, in the marshy delta where the river split into countless fingers reaching toward the sea, the cobra emerged as a symbol of power, of the dangerous and protective force that could strike with lethal precision, and Wadjet, the serpent goddess, came to embody the fierce guardianship of the northern territories. Her hood flared in eternal warning, her venom both curse and cure. But these were not yet the only divine forces recognized. Far from it, each town, each settlement, each community clustered around its particular bend in the river or its particular field or fishing ground, developed allegiance to local powers, to the crocodile who ruled the waters, to the ibis who waded in the shallows, to the falcon whose eyes could spot prey from heights unreachable by human sight. And here something crucial begins to reveal itself, something that would distinguish this emerging tradition from others. The tendency not to reject or suppress these local variations, but to accumulate them, to layer them, to allow multiple truths to coexist even when they seemed to contradict, so that later, much later, there would be not one creation story but several, not one path to the afterlife but many, not one supreme deity but rather a vast assembly of powers, each with their domains, their relationships, their particular myths and manifestations. In these early centuries of Pharaoh, before writing emerged to fix belief into text, the stories moved as stories do when carried only in memory and speech. They shifted, adapted, merged, and separated like the braided channels of the delta itself. A god from one village might be understood as the brother of a god from another, or as the same god wearing a different face, or as the enemy of that god, depending on the season, the crisis, the need of the moment. The dead were buried, as they had been for millennia, but slowly, gradually, the manner of burial began to change, to elaborate. Bodies that had once been placed in simple pits, wrapped perhaps in reed mats or animal skins, began to be accompanied by objects, a pot for water, a bowl for grain, tools that the person had used in life. And this shift, this beginning of grave goods, speaks to an emerging concept, that death was not cessation but transition, that the dead might still have needs, might still in some sense continue. the desert sand, hot and desiccating, naturally preserved bodies buried in shallow graves. And perhaps this is where the seed was planted, the observation that the dead need not decay into formlessness, that they could persist, could remain recognizably themselves, and if the body could be preserved, might not something else persist as well, some essential selfhood, some continuing awareness? By the time the first dynasty emerged, when a ruler named Narmer, or perhaps Menes, the histories blur and merge at this distance, unified the two lands into a single kingdom. The landscape was already populated with divine presences, already understood as a realm where the visible and invisible interpenetrated, where every element of the natural world could serve as manifestation of powers beyond human understanding. The king himself, this unifier, took on qualities that transcended the merely human. He became the living Horus, the falcon god whose eyes were the sun and moon. And in this identification, this fusion of human and divine, we see the establishment of a principle that would endure for 3,000 years. That rulership was not simply political power, but cosmic responsibility, that the king stood at the junction point between earth and heaven, between human community and divine order. At Abydos, in the desert behind the cultivation, the earliest royal tombs were cut into the ground, rooms and chambers lined with mud brick, roofed with timber brought from distant lands, and around these tombs were buried servants, retainers, people who would accompany the king into whatever realm awaited beyond death. A practice that speaks of both the value placed on continuity and the terrible weight of power in those formative years. Within these tombs, objects of staggering craftsmanship, vessels carved from stone so hard it would challenge modern tools, jewelry of gold and turquoise and carnelian, gaming boards for playing senet, that mysterious game whose rules have been lost, but whose boards appear again and again in burial contexts, suggesting it was more than mere entertainment, perhaps a symbolic journey, perhaps a way of negotiating fate. The sun, that most obvious and overwhelming presence in a land where clouds were rare and shade precious, began to accumulate layers of meaning. It was not merely light and heat, but a god, Ra, who traveled the sky in a boat, who each evening descended into the underworld and each morning emerged renewed, victorious over the forces of chaos and darkness. And this daily journey became a template, a cosmic pattern that human existence might echo and aspire to mirror. At Heliopolis, the city of the sun, now buried beneath modern Cairo's sprawl, priests developed cosmologies that would become foundational. They spoke of the primeval mound, the first land that rose from the waters of Nun, the infinite ocean of chaos that existed before creation. And on this mound stood Autumn, the complete one who brought forth from himself the first gods, Shu, the air, and Tefnut, moisture. And from their union came Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky, and thus the world took shape, structure emerging from formlessness, order from chaos. But this was only one telling. At Memphis, the ancient capital where the two lands joined, the god Ptah was understood as the creator, who brought the world into being not through biological generation, but through thought and speech, through divine word, conceiving creation in his heart and manifesting it through utterance. And this idea that consciousness and language could precede and shape material reality would resonate through Egyptian thought for millennia. The Pyramid Age had not yet begun. Those would come later. But already, stone was being worked in ways that suggest not just technical skill, but symbolic thinking. The step pyramid of Djoser, rising in stages like a stairway, like a crystallized form of the primeval mound, represented a leap in architectural ambition, in the ability to organize labor, to quarry and transport and precisely place massive blocks, and its architect, Imhotep, would himself eventually be deified, recognized as one who had achieved something beyond the ordinary human capacity. In these early dynasties, the third millennium before the Common Era, when Bronze Age civilizations were just beginning to coalesce around the Mediterranean and Near East, the people along the Nile were already developing a written language, hieroglyphs, sacred carvings, images that were simultaneously pictures and sounds, representations and abstractions. And this writing system, complex and beautiful and resistant to the kind of simplification that alphabets would later achieve, seemed perfectly suited to a worldview that saw meaning as layered, as requiring multiple levels of interpretation. The earliest religious texts, fragments and phrases found in tombs and on temple walls, speak in dense allusions, in formulas that clearly reference longer narratives now lost to us. They mention journeys through regions of the night, encounters with gatekeepers and judges, transformations into various forms, becoming a lotus flower, becoming a phoenix, becoming the morning sun. And these transformations suggest a fluidity of identity that stands in stark contrast to more fixed notions of selfhood. The idea that one might take different forms while remaining essentially oneself. Offerings were made daily, regularly, at tombs and shrines. Bread and beer, meat and fowl, incense and oil. And these offerings were not simply gifts in our modern sense. They were sustenance. They were the means by which the dead continued, by which the gods maintained their benevolent relationship with the human world, and the formulas that accompanied these offerings were carefully preserved, passed down, refined, becoming texts of power, utterances that could effect transformation, that could open doorways and establish connections between realms. The calendar itself became a sacred technology, the year divided into 3 seasons based on the river's cycle. Akhet, the inundation when the Nile rose and covered the fields. Peret, the emergence when the waters receded and crops could be planted. And Shemu, the harvest when grain was gathered before the next flood came. And this rhythm, so fundamental to survival, was understood as divine gift, as the result of cosmic order functioning as it should, as Ma'at, that essential principle of truth and balance and rightness, being maintained, and Ma'at herself, sometimes depicted as a goddess with an ostrich feather on her head, sometimes simply as the feather alone, came to represent the fundamental organizing principle of existence, the way things ought to be, the balance that must be maintained against the ever-present threat of chaos, of Isfet, disorder and injustice and the breakdown of proper relations, and the king's primary duty was understood as upholding Ma'at, ensuring that the cosmic and social order remained aligned, that rituals were performed, that truth was honored, that balance was preserved. In these formative centuries, these early dynasties, when Egypt was finding its form, consolidating its identity, developing the institutions and beliefs that would prove so remarkably enduring, we can see the seeds of everything that would follow, the gods taking shape, the afterlife acquiring geography and laws, the relationship between human and divine being articulated in stone and ritual and carefully preserved word, the past was already being venerated, already being looked to as a time of establishment, of foundation, when the gods walked the earth and the first kings received their authority directly from divine hands. And this orientation toward tradition, toward precedent, toward the tried and tested patterns, would become characteristic, would lead to a civilization that measured change in millennia rather than centuries, that found ways to absorb new ideas by claiming they were ancient, by discovering them in the old texts, in the time-honored forms. And so we arrive at the time of flowering, the Middle Kingdom, and the age that followed, when the beliefs that had been developing for centuries crystallized into forms that would define what we now recognize as the heart of this ancient vision. The pyramids already stood ancient by this time, weathered sentinels of an earlier age, and the great constructions of the Fourth Dynasty. Khufu's monument at Giza, Khafra's with its guardian sphinx, had become themselves objects of wonder even to those who lived 1,000 years after their building. Proof that the ancestors had achieved something of permanence, something that could outlast the individual life. The dynasty, the very language in which prayers were first uttered. But now, in this middle period, attention turned inward as much as upward. The elaborate royal burial complexes continued. Yes, but alongside them emerged a democratization of access, a spreading of practices once reserved for kings alone. The coffin texts appeared, inscribed on the wooden boxes that held the dead, spells and maps and instructions for navigating the afterlife. And these texts reveal something profound, that the journey beyond death was now understood to be available not only to the god-king, but to anyone who could afford the proper preparations, the proper knowledge, the proper words of power. The journey itself, as described in these texts, was neither simple nor assured. The deceased would rise from the tomb, would need to know the names of the boat parts to secure passage, would encounter gates guarded by beings with unsettling names, blood drinker who comes from the slaughterhouse, bone breaker who comes from the house of torture. And these guardians would demand passwords, would test the deceased's knowledge, would determine worthiness not through moral judgment alone, but through precise recitation, through knowing the right formulas, the right responses. The heart, understood as the seat of thought and will and memory, would be weighed against the feather of Mayat in the Hall of Two Truths, and this moment, depicted again and again on papyrus and tomb wall, shows the deceased standing before a great balance, while Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian of the necropolis, adjusts the scales, and Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods, records the result, and nearby waits Ammit, the devourer, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, ready to consume the hearts of those found wanting, those whose lives had been heavy with wrongdoing, with violation of Ma'at. But for those who passed this judgment, for those whose hearts balanced true against the feather, the afterlife opened into a realm called the Field of Reeds, Aru, a place imagined as an idealized version of Egypt itself, where crops grew abundantly, where the deceased would plow and sow and harvest in fields that never failed, where the Nile never flooded too high or too low, where existence continued in perfected form, eternal and secure. The gods by this time had developed complex relationships, family trees that twisted and merged in ways that defy simple genealogy. Osiris, once perhaps a local god of fertility and vegetation, had become the lord of the dead, the one who had himself died and been resurrected, whose story formed a central myth, murdered by his brother Set, the god of chaos and desert and foreign lands, dismembered and scattered, but gathered again by his wife Isis, whose magic was powerful enough to restore him to life, at least in the realm beyond death. And this myth, told and retold, elaborated and referenced, became a template for understanding death itself. Osiris had gone before, had made the journey, had shown that death need not be final, that proper ritual, proper devotion, proper knowledge could effect transformation, could turn the end into a beginning, the closing into an opening. Isis herself, the devoted wife, the powerful magician, the protective mother, accumulated epithets and powers. She became a goddess of 10,000 names, associated with the throne, with magic, with the star Sirius, whose heliacal rising coincided with the Nile's flood. She who could heal, who could protect, who knew the secret name of Ra himself, and thus held power even over the sun god. And her cult would eventually spread far beyond Egypt's borders, would be carried by merchants and soldiers and seekers to every corner of the Mediterranean world. Horus, the son of Isis and Osiris, born after his father's death, hidden in the marshes of the Delta, protected by his mother's magic from the murderous intentions of Set, grew to avenge his father, to battle Set for the throne of Egypt, and this conflict, cosmic and political simultaneously, was understood to replay itself in each succession, each new king becoming Horus, each dead king becoming Osiris, the pattern repeating, the roles passing from one generation to the next in eternal cycle. The temples grew larger, more elaborate. Karnak at Thebes expanded over centuries, each pharaoh adding halls and pylons and sanctuaries, creating a sacred complex of such vastness that one could walk for hours through columned forests, through courts where festivals were celebrated, through dark inner sanctums where only the highest priests could enter, where the god resided in statue form, tended daily like a living king, washed and dressed and offered food, awakened in the morning and put to rest at night. These rituals, performed daily behind closed doors, were essential to maintaining cosmic order. The god needed to be fed, needed to be honored, needed to receive the devotion that sustained the relationship between divine and human. And in return, the god provided protection, ensured the flood came, ensured the sun rose, ensured that Ma'at prevailed over chaos, that the world continued to function as it should. The priesthood became hereditary, specialized. There were priests who performed specific rituals, priests who maintained the temple complex, priests who interpreted dreams and omens, priests who could read the old texts, the archives that stretched back generations. And these priests held knowledge that was powerful, that was guarded, that was transmitted through apprenticeship and initiation, through years of learning the proper forms, the proper timing, the proper words that could not be altered without risking the efficacy of the ritual itself. Magic, Heka, was not separate from religion but intrinsic to it. The gods themselves used Heka. It was the force through which creation had been accomplished, through which the sunboat traveled each night through the underworld, through which transformations were effected, and humans could access this power through amulets inscribed with protective spells, through words spoken with proper intent, through knowing the true names of things. For to know the true name was to have power over the thing named. The Book of the Dead, that collection of spells that emerged in the New Kingdom, was never a single canonical text, but rather a library of options. A deceased person's family would select which spells to include, which transformations they wanted their loved one to be able to accomplish, and these papyri, sometimes stretching many feet in length, beautifully illustrated with vignettes showing the deceased adoring gods, sailing in boats, transforming into various forms, accompanied the body into the tomb, placed near the mummy where it could be accessed, where its power could be activated through the ritual of the opening of the mouth. This ceremony, performed on the mummy and on statues, meant to serve as eternal homes for the life force, involved touching the mouth and eyes with sacred implements, with the pesesh kef blade, with the adze used in carpentry, and through these ritual touches, through the accompanying spells, the senses were restored. The deceased could again see and hear and speak and eat, could again participate in existence even while existing in a different realm. The Ka, the Ba, the Ak, these elements of selfhood were distinguished in ways that our single word soul cannot capture. The Ka was the life force, the vital energy that animated the body, symbolized by upraised arms, sustained through offerings. The Ba was closer to what we might call personality, depicted as a human-headed bird that could move between the tomb and the world of the living, that could enjoy the shade of trees, that could return to the body. And the Ak was the transformed state, the blessed dead who had successfully navigated the afterlife's trials, who shone like stars, who had become effective spirits capable of interceding in the world of the living. At certain times of year, festivals brought the gods out from their dark sanctuaries, their statues placed in portable shrines carried on the shoulders of priests, processioning through the streets, and the people could approach, could ask questions that would be answered through the movements of the carriers, yes or no, the god's shrine tilting forward or drawing back, divine judgment made manifest, accessible to ordinary people, to those seeking justice, seeking confirmation, seeking connection with powers beyond themselves. The Opet festival at Thebes, one of the grandest, saw the statue of Amun journey from Karnak to Luxor Temple, a distance of several miles, accompanied by musicians and dancers, by offerings of flowers and incense, by the pharaoh himself, and this journey, repeated annually, renewed the king's divine mandate, recharged his royal Ka, ensured that the relationship between God and king remained strong, that the cosmic order remained intact. Animals sacred to particular gods were kept at temples, fed and tended with reverence. The Apis bull at Memphis, recognized by specific markings, was understood as a manifestation of Ptah, and when the bull died, it was mummified and buried with full ceremony in the Serapeum, in catacombs lined with massive granite sarcophagi, and a new Apis would be sought, would be found, would take up the divine role, the God made flesh in a form that could be seen and approached and honored, cats in Bubastis, ibises at Hermopolis, crocodiles at Kom Ombo. Each temple complex had its sacred animals, and pilgrims would come bearing mummified animals as offerings, cats and ibises and dogs and hawks, bred specifically for this purpose, mummified by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands, offered to the gods, in a practice that speaks to the accessibility of devotion, that anyone could participate, could make an offering, could seek favor, or give thanks, or simply express reverence. The desert, always present, always pressing against the narrow, fertile strip of the river valley, was the domain of Set, the red land, as opposed to the black land of cultivation, and yet the desert also held sacred sites. Osiris was said to be buried at Abydos, and pilgrims journeyed there, left stelae inscribed with prayers, with requests that they might share in Osiris's resurrection, that their names might be remembered, that offerings might be made for them in perpetuity. Memory, remembrance, the speaking of the name, these were forms of continued existence. To be forgotten was to die a second death. To have one's name erased from monuments was to be unmade. And so the wealthy commissioned tombs decorated with scenes of daily life, of feasting and farming and fishing, not just to provide magically for the afterlife, but to preserve their identity, to ensure that their names would be spoken, that they would be remembered, that they would continue. The centuries turned. Dynasties rose and fell. Foreign rulers came. The Hyksos from the east with their chariots and composite bows. The Cushites from the south who claimed the ancient traditions as their own. And through these changes, through periods of fragmentation and reunion, through conquest and resistance, the religious framework endured, adapted, absorbed new elements while maintaining its essential structures. The new kingdom brought empire, wealth flowing into Egypt from Nubia and the Levant, gold and tribute and captives, and this wealth was poured into the temples. Karnak expanded to unprecedented scale, its hypostyle hall with 134 columns arranged in rows like a petrified forest, each column thick enough that it would take 6 people linking hands to encircle it, and the capitals, carved as papyrus bundles, as lotus blossoms, transformed stone into vegetation, the temple itself becoming a symbolic representation of the primeval marsh from which creation emerged. Akhenaten, the heretic king, attempted something unprecedented, a revolution in religion itself. He closed the temples of the traditional gods, declared that only the Aten, the sun disk, was to be worshipped, moved the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, and for a brief period, perhaps 17 years, the old practices were suppressed, the many gods rejected in favor of one, and the art of the period shows the shift. The king and his family depicted in intimate moments, raising their hands to the sun, whose rays end in tiny hands offering ankhs, offering life. But this transformation, so radical, so contrary to the accumulated weight of tradition, could not survive its instigator. When Akhenaten died, when his young son-in-law Tutankhamun took the throne, the old gods returned, the temples reopened, the priests regained their authority, and Akhenaten's name was erased from king lists, his monuments dismantled, his city abandoned to the desert sand, as if the entire episode could be undone, could be excised from the continuous thread of tradition. Yet something had been revealed, the possibility of change, the recognition that what had seemed eternal was, in fact, contingent, was maintained through choice and power, and the consent of those who upheld it. And though the restoration was complete on the surface, though the old forms returned in force, perhaps something subtle had shifted, some recognition of the constructed nature of the divine order. The Ramesside period that followed saw a reassertion of tradition. Ramesses II, who would reign for 67 years, covered the land with monuments proclaiming his piety, his victories, his role as intermediary between gods and humanity. The great temple at Abu Simbel, cut into the living rock, its facade dominated by 4 colossal seated figures of the king, and twice a year the sun would penetrate deep into the interior, would illuminate the sanctuary where statues of the gods sat alongside the deified king. Cosmic alignment made architectural, time and space and stone coordinated in demonstration of order, of control, of the proper functioning of Ma'at. But time was already beginning its slow work of transformation. The great age of pyramid building lay a millennium in the past. The Old Kingdom was as distant to Ramesses as Ramesses is now to us, and there was already a sense of looking backward, of trying to maintain connection with an ever-receding origin. Copies were made of older texts. Archives were consulted. Precedents were sought in the records of ancestors who themselves had been consulting the records of their ancestors. The Third Intermediate Period brought fragmentation. The kingdom split between competing powers, Libyan dynasties in the north, Nubian dynasties in the south, and through this political chaos the temples became centers of continuity, repositories of tradition and learning, the priests maintaining the daily rituals even as the identity of the nominal ruler shifted. Even as Egypt's power in the wider world waned, foreign gods began to appear. Astarte from the Levant, Baal and Anat, absorbed into the Egyptian pantheon, identified with local deities, Astarte with Sekhmet perhaps, or existing alongside, the theological flexibility that had always characterized Egyptian religion allowing for these additions, these expansions of the divine assembly. And Egyptian gods traveled outward too. Isis and Serapis, a Hellenized form of Osiris, would eventually have temples in Rome, in Athens, in cities throughout the Mediterranean world. The late period saw Persian conquest, then liberation, then conquest again. The Persians took the titles of pharaoh. Some made offerings to Egyptian gods, participated in the forms of legitimate rule, while others were remembered as oppressors, as violators of sacred sites, the distinction perhaps depending less on actual policy than on the success or failure of their reign, on whether they were seen as upholding or disrupting Ma'at. Alexander came, conquered, died young, and his general Ptolemy took Egypt, founded a dynasty that would last 3 centuries. And the Ptolemies, Greek-speaking, Macedonian in origin, nevertheless presented themselves as pharaohs, built temples in the traditional style, had themselves depicted on walls wearing the double crown, performing the ancient rituals, making offerings to gods whose myths they may or may not have believed, but whose symbolic power they certainly recognized. The temple at Edfu, built during the Ptolemaic period, preserves on its walls something precious. The myth of the conflict between Horus and Set, recorded in detail, a narrative that had surely been told for millennia, but here finds literary form, and the temple itself, remarkably preserved, its pylon and courtyard and hypostyle hall still standing, gives us perhaps the clearest picture of what these sacred spaces looked like, how they functioned, how the architecture guided movement from the public outer courts through progressively more restricted spaces toward the sanctuary where the god resided in darkness. The walls were covered with texts, offering scenes, king lists, astronomical ceilings showing the night sky, the deacons, the constellations through which the sun passed, and these inscriptions served multiple purposes. They were decoration, they were instruction, they were magical protection, they were permanent prayer. They ensured that the rituals would continue even if every priest forgot them. Because the walls themselves remembered, the stone preserved the knowledge against time's erosion. Cleopatra, the seventh of that name, the last Ptolemaic ruler, spoke Egyptian, participated in the religious festivals, had herself depicted in traditional royal regalia on temple walls, and when she died, when Egypt became a Roman province, when Augustus took control, the temples continued to function. Tourists from Rome came to marvel at the pyramids, at the colossi, at monuments already ancient beyond their comprehension. New temples were built, even under Roman rule, at Dendera, at Philae, in traditional forms, with traditional iconography, the gods still receiving their offerings, still being awakened and fed and honored. But increasingly, these practices existed in a world that had moved on, that had other gods, other philosophies, other ways of understanding the relationship between human and divine. Christianity spread, first as a persecuted minority, then as official religion, and the temples were closed by imperial edict. The statues were sometimes destroyed, sometimes defaced, sometimes simply abandoned, and the knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs, maintained for 3,000 years through unbroken chains of priestly instruction, finally broke. The last person who could read the sacred writing died, and the texts became mere decoration, beautiful but mute, their voices silenced, yet the monuments remained, the pyramid, the temples, the tombs, enduring through centuries of sand and sun and occasional flood, occasionally quarried for building stone, occasionally occupied by hermits and monks, occasionally wondered at by travelers who could not read the inscriptions but could sense the weight of time, the accumulated devotion, the civilizational confidence that had believed building in stone for eternity was not hubris but appropriate, was simply what one did when one understood the cosmic order and one's place within it. The knowledge was not entirely lost. Traditions persisted in fragmented form, in folk practices, in the Coptic language that descended from ancient Egyptian, in stories and local customs that carried echoes of older beliefs. The memory blurred, transformed, but not entirely erased, waiting in a sense for the day when the code would be broken, when Champollion would decipher the Rosetta Stone, when the voices preserved in stone would speak again, and in speaking they would reveal not a primitive superstition, not a simple fear-driven propitiation of natural forces, but a sophisticated theological system, a comprehensive worldview that had grappled with the fundamental questions of existence, that had developed multiple complementary answers, that had created space for both grand cosmic mythology and intimate personal devotion, that had built institutions capable of lasting longer than any empire before or since. The gods did not demand belief in the way later monotheisms would. They did not require faith as internal conviction. What they required was proper action, correct ritual, the maintenance of ma'at through behavior, through offerings, through the speaking of the right words at the right time. And this emphasis on orthopraxy rather than orthodoxy allowed for a remarkable flexibility, a tolerance for contradiction, a comfort with mystery that never insisted on reducing the divine to a single coherent system. Multiple truths could coexist. The sun could be Ra in the morning, Atum in the evening, could be identified with Horus, could be the eye of the sky goddess, could be all of these simultaneously without any sense that these different formulations canceled each other out. And this multiplicity, this layering of meaning, reflected perhaps a deep understanding that the divine, whatever its ultimate nature, could not be captured in any single image, any single story, any single name. The civilization that created this religious vision is gone, its language a subject of academic study, its monuments preserved in museums and carefully maintained archaeological sites. But something of its achievement endures in the questions it asked, in the answers it proposed to, in the sheer audacity of believing that humans could build for eternity, could maintain order, could transform death into doorway, could know the names of gods. And perhaps what calls to us across these thousands of years, what still resonates in the quiet hours when we contemplate our own mortality, our own place in the vast sweep of time, is not so much the specific beliefs, the particular gods with their animal heads and their mythic genealogies, but rather the underlying impulse, the refusal to accept death as absolute ending, the insistence that meaning could be made, could be preserved, could outlast the fragile vessel of flesh and bone. They looked at the stars, those points of light that wheeled overhead with perfect regularity, and saw in that celestial order a template, a pattern that earthly life should mirror. The king was not just a political leader, but a cosmic functionary, responsible for maintaining alignment between above and below, between the divine realm and the human, and when he failed, when Ma'at was violated, when injustice prevailed or ritual was neglected, the consequences were understood to be not merely social but cosmological. The very fabric of reality threatened with unraveling. This is a vision of enormous coherence, of existence understood as fundamentally interconnected, where nothing stood alone, where every action rippled outward, where the proper preparation of a body for burial, the correct pronunciation of a spell, the faithful performance of a daily temple ritual by a priest the king would never meet, all these things mattered. All contributed to the maintenance of order. All played their part in holding chaos at bay. The tombs themselves, those houses of eternity, speak to this understanding of interconnection. They were not meant to be sealed and forgotten, but to be visited, to receive offerings, to remain part of the community of the living, even as their occupants had crossed into the community of the justified dead, and the scenes painted on their walls, the biographical inscriptions, the prayers for bread and beer and all good things, these were not mere decoration but active magical technology, ensuring through representation that what was depicted would continue, would be available, would sustain the deceased through eternity. There is something moving in this, in the caretaken, in the conviction that carved stone and preserved body and properly spoken word could achieve what seems impossible, could defeat time, could maintain identity across the boundary of death. The mother who placed amulets between the wrappings of her child's mummy, the son who commissioned a stela for his father's tomb, the priest who performed the offering ritual for ancestors he had never known, all participating in a vast intergenerational project, a collective effort to ensure that death would not have final victory, and the gods themselves, in their multiplicity, in their complexity, in their refusal to be simple, seem almost to acknowledge the inadequacy of any single story, any single image, to capture the fullness of divine reality. Ra can be depicted as a man with a falcon head crowned with the sun disk, or as a scarab beetle pushing the solar disk across the sky, or as an old man leaning on a staff in the evening, or as a cat killing the serpent of chaos. And each image reveals something true, something partial, something that needs the other images to complete it. This comfort with paradox, with multiple simultaneous truths, with both and rather than either or, allowed Egyptian religion to absorb foreign influences without losing its identity, to evolve without breaking continuity, to maintain traditions across spans of time that saw empires rise and fall, languages evolve beyond recognition, technologies transform, and through all this change, the essential patterns persisted: the daily ritual, the care for the dead, the maintenance of Ma'at, the relationship between human and divine mediated through image and offering and carefully preserved word. We might ask what was lost when the temples closed, when the last hieroglyphs were carved, when the knowledge of how to read them died with its keepers. And the answer is not just information, not just historical data, but an entire way of being in the world, a framework for understanding existence that had proven remarkably durable, remarkably sustaining, for longer than our current civilization has yet endured. The silence that fell was profound. The monuments remained, but their voices were stilled. The gods no longer received their daily bread, no longer were awakened at dawn and put to rest at evening, no longer traveled in festival procession through streets lined with celebrants. The complex theological debates, the priestly scholarship, the lived experience of a religion that had shaped every aspect of existence, from the grandest state ceremony to the smallest household shrine. All this contracted, fragmented, survived only in traces, in half-remembered customs, in stories whose meanings had been forgotten. And yet, the monuments endured, waiting perhaps for a time when they could speak again, when the code could be broken, when modern minds could begin, however imperfectly, to reconstruct something of what had been lost. The desert wind moves across the sand as it has always moved, erasing footprints, revealing what was buried, burying what was revealed, and the temples stand patient in the sun, their shadows shortening and lengthening with the day's passage, their stones holding memories of hands long turned to dust, of voices that spoke in a language no living person learned at their mother's knee. I walk again through those columned halls, feeling the coolness of stone that has known both the heat of noon and the chill of desert night for thousands of years. And the silence here is not empty but full, dense with accumulated time, with the weight of all those prayers and offerings and carefully performed rituals, with the hopes of those who believed they were building something eternal and who were not entirely wrong. Because something does endure, not the specific beliefs perhaps, not the daily practices, not the living relationship between devotee and deity that characterized the religion in its flowering, but the achievement itself, the creation of a symbolic universe so rich, so layered, so carefully constructed that we are still unpacking its meanings, still discovering its depths, still finding in its art and architecture and texts new ways of thinking about the perennial human questions. The sun sets as it set for those ancient priests, as it set for the workers who carved the tombs, as it set for the pharaohs who built the temples, and in its setting we might see what they saw, not merely a physical phenomenon, but a cosmic drama. Ra, beginning his nightly journey through the underworld, facing the serpent of chaos, navigating dangers, and emerging triumphant at dawn, renewed, victorious, the pattern repeating, the cycle continuing, death followed always by rebirth. The stars emerge one by one, and they are the same stars those ancient astronomers studied, mapped, incorporated into their cosmology, the same patterns, the same slow wheeling across the seasons. And for a moment the distance collapses. The separation between then and now feels less absolute. We are all looking at the same sky, all trying to make meaning from the mystery of existence, all facing the same fundamental questions about life and death and what, if anything, lies beyond. The night deepens, the darkness becomes complete, and in this darkness, this absence of light that the ancient Egyptians knew so well, there is also a kind of peace, a letting go of the need to understand everything, to have all answers, to resolve all paradoxes. Perhaps what they knew, what they built their entire civilization around, was the possibility of living gracefully with mystery, of creating beauty and meaning in the face of uncertainty, of building something lasting while acknowledging the reality of impermanence. The monuments will outlast us as they outlasted their builders. The stone will endure longer than memory, longer than language, longer than the specific meanings encoded in carved relief and painted plaster, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the achievement lies not in the permanence of belief, but in the act of building, of creating, of attempting to touch something eternal, even knowing that we ourselves are bound by time. The wind has stopped, the air perfectly still, and in this stillness, this suspension between day and night, between past and present, between what was known and what remains mysterious, there is a quality of attention, of waiting, as if the stones themselves are listening, as if the accumulated devotion of millennia has left something in the air, some residue of reverence, of care, of the human capacity to reach beyond ourselves towards something greater, and slowly, so slowly that the transition is barely perceptible, the darkness begins to thin, the first intimation of dawn touching the eastern horizon, and another day begins, another cycle, another turning of the wheel that has turned since before pyramids rose from the desert floor, since before the first hieroglyph was carved, since before humans looked at the stars and wondered and found in their wondering the seeds of all the stories, all the gods, all the elaborate cosmologies that would grow and flower and eventually fade, leaving only stones and silence and the endless patient turning of the earth beneath an unchanging sky. There is a kind of quiet that settles over certain rooms, a stillness that feels older than the walls themselves. And tonight I find myself standing in one such room, a grand chamber where ideas have lived and breathed for centuries, where the shape of nations has been drawn and redrawn in words and principles. The light here is amber, filtered through tall windows that have witnessed the passage of countless deliberations, and in this gentle glow I can see the outlines of wooden benches arranged in careful rows, each one worn smooth by the weight of representatives who have sat and spoken and shaped the course of their countries. This is a place where governance takes form, where the abstract notion of how people might organize themselves into nations becomes something tangible, something we can touch and examine. And as I move through this space, I feel the presence of all the different ways human beings have tried to answer one essential question: how shall we live together under shared rules? The air carries a scent of old paper and polished wood, and there is something deeply calming in knowing that this question has been asked in so many languages, in so many capitals, in chambers that look like this one, and chambers that look nothing like it at all, some ornate and gilded, others spare and modern, but all of them holding the same fundamental purpose. I let my gaze drift across the rows of seats, and I begin to see them not as empty chairs, but as vessels holding different traditions, different philosophies of power and representation, because comparative government is really the study of all these vessels, the examination of how various societies have designed their political containers, some presidential, some parliamentary, some federal, some unitary, each one reflecting particular histories and particular dreams. In one corner of the chamber there is a coat of arms carved into dark oak, and I move closer to trace the symbols with my eyes, the way each element represents some value or achievement the nation holds dear. And it occurs to me that every system of government is like this, a kind of heraldry, a set of symbols and structures that declare what a people believe about authority and liberty, and the proper relationship between the individual and the state. The windows are growing dimmer now, and the amber light is deepening into something closer to gold. And in this transitional hour between day and evening, I feel myself settling into the rhythm of contemplation, the gentle pace of someone who has all the time needed to understand something complex and beautiful. I think about the word comparative itself, the way it implies setting things side by side, not to judge which is superior, but simply to see more clearly what each one is. And there is something inherently peaceful in this act of comparison, this willingness to observe without rushing to conclusion, to notice the particular genius in a Westminster system and the particular strength in a presidential republic, to see how a federal structure solves certain problems while creating others. The room seems to expand as I consider this, as if the walls themselves are making space for all the world's parliaments and congresses and assemblies, all the councils and chambers where human beings gather to make collective decisions. And I can almost hear the echo of debates conducted in Mandarin and English and French and Arabic and Spanish, each language carrying its own way of conceiving political life. Near the center of the chamber there is a lectern, simple and unadorned, and I imagine all the speeches that have been delivered from such places, the careful arguments about constitutions and rights, the passionate defenses of particular visions for how power should be distributed, and beneath all that passion there is always structure, always the invisible architecture that determines who can speak and when, and with what authority. This architecture is what comparative government reveals, the hidden frameworks that make some nations run smoothly while others stumble, the way institutions can channel ambition and conflict into productive dialogue or let them spill over into dysfunction. And understanding these frameworks requires patience, requires the kind of slow observation I am practicing now, letting each detail emerge in its own time. The light has shifted again, softer now, and the golden hour is giving way to the blue hour. That liminal time when the world feels suspended between states, and this feels right somehow, because the study of government is always about these in-between spaces, the way power flows between branches, the negotiation between central authority and local autonomy, the balance between majority rule and minority rights. I can feel my breathing slow to match the pace of this chamber, the deep calm of a place built for deliberation rather than haste. And I know that in the words to come, I will travel through time and across continents, examining the many forms that democratic governance and authoritarian rule have taken, tracing the evolution of constitutions and the rise and fall of different models. But for now, I simply stand here, present in this quiet room, ready to begin the journey through the landscape of comparative government. The story begins long before this chamber existed, long before the word government carried its modern meaning, and to understand how human beings came to organize themselves into different political systems, we must travel back to a time when the very idea of comparing such systems would have seemed strange, because for most of human history people knew only one way, the way of their own tribe or city or kingdom. But there were places scattered across the ancient world where something new began to stir, where people started to ask not just who should rule, but how rule itself should be structured. And one of those places was a peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean, where rocky hillsides overlooked a sapphire sea. Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era, a city-state small enough that you could walk across it in an afternoon, and yet within its boundaries something unprecedented was taking shape. The citizens were experimenting with a form of governance they called democratia, rule by the demos, the people themselves. I can almost see them gathering in the agora, the marketplace that served as the heart of civic life, merchants and farmers and craftsmen setting aside their work to debate the issues of the day. And this was not representation as we know it now. This was direct participation, citizens voting with their own hands on matters of war and peace and law. But even as Athens developed this radical experiment, other Greek cities were trying different approaches. Sparta, with its dual kingship and rigid military hierarchy, Corinth, with its oligarchy of wealthy families, and the Greeks themselves began to notice these differences, began to compare and contrast, to ask which a system produced the most stability or the greatest glory. Aristotle walked through streets not unlike these, observing, cataloging, trying to understand the varieties of political organization, and he collected the constitutions of 158 city-states. Studying each one as a naturalist might study different species of birds, noting their characteristics and their tendencies, their strengths and vulnerabilities. He saw that some states were ruled by one person, others by a few, still others by the many, and he noticed that each form could manifest in a good version or a corrupted version. Monarchy could become tyranny, aristocracy could decay into oligarchy, and even democracy, rule by the people, could degenerate into mob rule if not carefully structured. This was perhaps the first true work of comparative government, this patient observation that different structures produce different outcomes, and Aristotle's insight that institutions matter, that the rules governing how decisions are made shape the character of a nation, would echo through the centuries that followed. Meanwhile, far to the east, in the river valleys of China, a different kind of political thinking was emerging. Confucius, walking the roads between feudal states during the spring and autumn period, observing the chaos of competing kingdoms and developing a philosophy of governance based not on the participation of citizens, but on the cultivation of virtue in rulers. The Chinese tradition emphasized harmony and hierarchy, the idea that society functions best when each person understands their role and fulfills it with excellence. And this produced systems of government radically different from those taking shape in Greece. Centralized bureaucracies staffed by scholars selected through competitive examinations, a meritocracy of learning rather than a democracy of participation. And these two traditions, the Greek and the Chinese, would influence vast regions and countless generations, creating distinct approaches to the fundamental questions of political life, approaches that even now shape how different nations conceive of authority and citizenship and the proper role of government. But there were other tributaries feeding into this great river of political thought. Rome rising from a collection of villages on 7 hills to become a republic, then an empire, and in that transformation offering lessons about how institutions can evolve, how a system designed for a small city-state strains and ultimately breaks under the weight of vast territories and diverse populations. The Roman Republic gave us the Senate, a body of elders who provided continuity and wisdom, and the popular assemblies where citizens voted on laws and elected magistrates, and the elaborate system of checks whereby tribunes could veto actions harmful to the common people, and consuls served in pairs so that neither could accumulate too much power. I imagine standing in the Forum Romanum as twilight descends, watching the shadows lengthen across marble columns, and feeling the presence of all those careful institutional arrangements. The Romans were brilliant engineers, not just of aqueducts and roads, but of political structures. They understood that power needed to be divided and balanced. That ambition could be made to counteract ambition, but they also discovered the limits of such arrangements, learned the hard way that institutions are only as strong as the commitment of those who operate them. And when generals with loyal armies found they could bypass the Senate, when demagogues discovered they could appeal directly to the mob, when the forms were preserved but the substance had drained away, the Republic gave way to emperors and the long, slow slide into imperial rule. These ancient experiments, Greek and Roman and Chinese, laid the groundwork for all that would come after. They established the vocabulary we still use: democracy and oligarchy, republic and empire, monarchy and tyranny. And they demonstrated that governance is not natural or inevitable, but constructed, something human beings design and redesign in response to circumstances and ideals. For many centuries after Rome's fall, Europe fragmented into a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities, feudal arrangements where power was personal rather than institutional, where the relationship between lord and vassal mattered more than abstract constitutions. And during these centuries, the art of comparing governments largely slept, waiting for new circumstances to awaken it. But even in this feudal age, there were glimmers. The development of Parliament in England, beginning as an assembly the king convened when he needed to raise taxes, gradually asserting its own prerogatives, establishing the principle that the monarch could not simply impose his will, but needed the consent of at least some portion of the governed, And there were the Italian city-states of the Renaissance, Florence and Venice and Genoa, experimenting with republican forms, creating elaborate systems of councils and committees, developing techniques for preventing any one family or faction from dominating, rotating offices, using sortition, drawing lots to select officials so that chance rather than ambition determined who would serve. Venice particularly fascinated observers. This republic that had endured for centuries, longer than most kingdoms, with its great council and its senate, and its doge elected for life, but constrained by law and custom. Visitors came from across Europe to study the Venetian system, to understand how it maintained stability, while other states convulsed with civil war and revolution, and slowly, gradually, the idea of comparative government began to revive. The notion that one might study different political systems not to prove the superiority of one's own, but to learn, to borrow useful innovations, to understand the relationship between institutional design and political outcomes. Machiavelli in Florence, writing his discourses on Livy, comparing the Roman Republic to the Italian states of his own time, asking what made republics strong or weak, what allowed them to expand or caused them to decay, and his analysis was unsentimental, focused on power and incentives rather than ideals, but it was comparative. It looked at evidence from different times and places. Then came the great upheavals of the 17th century, the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, the beheading of a king and the establishment of constitutional monarchy, and suddenly political arrangements that had seemed fixed and eternal were revealed to be contingent, subject to challenge and change. Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, writing in the aftermath of these upheavals, trying to understand the foundations of political authority, why people submit to government at all, and what limits, if any, constrain governmental power. And though they reached different conclusions, both engaged in a kind of thought experiment that was implicitly comparative, imagining different possible arrangements and reasoning about their consequences. Locke particularly emphasized the idea of government as a contract, a mutual agreement between rulers and ruled, and the notion that governments could be dissolved if they violated the terms of this contract, if they became tyrannical, and these ideas would travel across the Atlantic, would shape the thinking of colonists who found themselves in a new world, trying to establish governance for communities far from the centers of European power. But before we cross that ocean, before we arrive at the great wave of constitution making that would sweep the late 18th century, we must pause here in this earlier moment. This time when the systematic study of comparative government was just beginning to crystallize, when observers were starting to collect examples, to classify types, to reason about causes and effects. Montesquieu, in his chateau in France, reading voraciously about governments ancient and modern, traveling to England to observe Parliament in action, and then writing his Spirit of the Laws, a massive comparative analysis that examined how climate and geography and religion and commerce all influence the character of political systems, how different forms of government suited different circumstances. He gave us the theory of separation of powers, the idea that liberty is best preserved when legislative and executive and judicial functions are divided among different bodies, each checking the others, and this insight, born from comparing the English system to the French absolutism of his own country, would become perhaps the single most influential idea in the design of modern governments. I can feel the weight of all these centuries, all these thinkers and experiments and hard-won lessons, and the room around me seems to hold them all, the accumulated wisdom of human beings trying to solve the puzzle of how to live together under law, how to create order without tyranny, how to permit liberty without descending into chaos. The light has dimmed further now, the blue hour deepening toward night, and in this gathering darkness I sense we are approaching a threshold, approaching the moment when comparative government would become not just an intellectual exercise, but a practical necessity, when new nations would arise and their founders would deliberately study the examples of history, would consciously borrow and adapt and innovate, creating systems designed from the ground up with all the lessons of the past in mind. But that threshold would not be crossed all at once. It required crisis, required the kind of rupture that forces people to reimagine everything they thought they knew about governance. And that rupture came in the late 18th century, when 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America declared their independence from the British Crown. The men who gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776 were not radicals by temperament. Many were lawyers and merchants, planters and scholars, but they found themselves in a radical situation, breaking away from what they had known, and they understood that independence meant more than separation. It meant having to construct something new. At first they tried a loose confederation, a league of sovereign states bound together only for common defense and trade, but this arrangement proved too weak, unable to raise revenue or enforce its decisions, and so they gathered again in that same city of Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to try once more. The room where they met was kept shuttered despite the heat, windows closed so that their deliberations would remain secret, and in that stifling chamber they debated through the long months of summer, arguing about representation and sovereignty, about how to balance the interests of large states and small, how to prevent the concentration of power while still creating a government strong enough to function. And here is where comparative government became practical rather than merely theoretical, because these men had studied, had read their Montesquieu and their Locke, had examined the history of Greece and Rome, had observed the workings of Parliament, and they consciously drew on all these examples, borrowing some elements, rejecting others, trying to design a system that would avoid the failures they had identified in past experiments. They created a federal system, dividing power between national and state governments, something the ancient world had never quite achieved, and they separated powers at the national level, giving legislative authority to Congress, executive power to a president, judicial responsibility to a Supreme Court, each branch with its own source of legitimacy and its own means of checking the others. The legislative branch itself was split, a House of Representatives apportioned by population, reflecting the democratic principle, and a Senate with equal representation for each state, preserving the federal principle, and laws would have to pass both chambers, would have to satisfy both majority will and federal balance. This was synthesis. This was comparative government in action, taking the bicameral structure from England, but adapting it to new purposes, embracing separation of powers, but implementing it more completely than the British had, creating an elected executive but limiting his term and constraining his powers, learning from Rome's dictators and England's kings what to avoid. And when the Constitution was finished and sent out for ratification, the debates that followed were themselves exercises in comparative analysis. The Federalist Papers comparing the proposed system to historical confederacies, to the republics of antiquity, arguing point by point why this particular design would succeed where others had failed. But even as this new system was being born, even as the United States was demonstrating that a large republic could be deliberately constructed according to rational principles, another revolution was convulsing France, and this revolution would follow a very different path. The French began with high ideals, with declarations of the rights of man and citizen, with the dream of replacing absolute monarchy with constitutional government, but they had no tradition of representative institutions to build upon, no long history of parliamentary development like England's. And the revolution spiraled through constitutions, each one replaced by another, each experiment more radical than the last. First a constitutional monarchy, then a republic, then the terror, then the Directory, and finally Napoleon, crowning himself emperor and spreading his legal code across Europe at the point of a sword. And the pattern seemed to confirm the fears of those who doubted whether revolutionary change could ever produce stable government. Yet Napoleon's conquests had an unintended effect. They disrupted the old order across the continent, planted the seeds of constitutional government in places that had known only absolute rule, and when he finally fell, when the monarchs were restored, they could not simply resurrect the past. The ideas had spread too far. The 19th century became an age of constitutions, of nations writing down the rules that would govern them, and each new constitution reflected choices, decisions about presidential versus parliamentary systems, about federalism versus unitary states, about how much power to vest in monarchs versus elected assemblies. Britain never wrote a single constitutional document, evolved instead through precedent and statute, gradually extending the franchise, slowly shifting power from crown to cabinet to commons, and this evolutionary approach became one model, the idea that institutions could adapt organically over time. But others preferred the American approach, a written constitution as a founding document, a clear statement of first principles, and throughout Latin America, as colonies gained independence from Spain and Portugal, they looked to the United States Constitution as a template, adopting federal systems and separated powers and presidential executives. Yet these transplants often struggled. The same institutions that worked in North America seemed to produce instability in South America, alternating between chaos and dictatorship, and observers began to realize that institutional design alone was not enough, that constitutions had to fit with culture and history and social structure, that you could not simply copy a system from one context and expect it to flourish in another. This was a sobering lesson, a recognition that comparative government was more complex than simply identifying the best system and replicating it. Each nation had to find arrangements suited to its particular circumstances, its level of economic development, its ethnic and religious composition, its historical experience with authority and liberty. Germany in the mid-19th century offered another variation. Bismarck, forging unity through blood and iron, creating an empire with a constitution that gave voting rights and a parliament, but preserved enormous power for the Kaiser and his appointed chancellor, a hybrid system that satisfied neither liberals nor conservatives entirely, but held together a diverse collection of kingdoms and principalities. And Japan, opening to the world after centuries of isolation, sent delegations to study European governments, and they chose the Prussian model, a constitutional monarchy with a strong executive, an arrangement that seemed to offer modernization without democracy, development without the disorder they associated with parliamentary systems. Each of these choices reflected particular fears and aspirations, particular judgments about what worked and what didn't. And the act of choosing required comparison, required looking at the experience of other nations and reasoning about what might succeed in one's own circumstances. The late 19th century saw the rise of what we might call scientific comparative government, scholars systematically collecting constitutions, classifying governmental forms, trying to identify patterns and principles. Woodrow Wilson, before he became president, writing Congressional Government, comparing the American system unfavorably to the British parliamentary model, arguing that separation of powers produced deadlock and irresponsibility. And there was Lord Bryce traveling through America, writing his massive study of the American Commonwealth, examining how federalism actually functioned, how political parties organized themselves, how state governments differed from one another, bringing the eye of a comparative observer to a system that Americans themselves often took for granted. The British Empire at its height became a laboratory of governmental forms, colonies and dominions trying different arrangements, some with appointed governors, others with elected assemblies, some evolving towards self-government, while others remained under direct rule, and each variation offered lessons about the relationship between metropolitan power and colonial autonomy. Canada developed a federal system necessary to accommodate French and English populations, but chose parliamentary government rather than presidential, creating a hybrid that combined British institutions with federal structure, and Australia and New Zealand followed similar paths. Westminster systems adapted to frontier conditions and federal necessities. India, under British rule, saw the gradual introduction of representative institutions, legislative councils with some elected members, systems that gave Indians experience in parliamentary procedures while keeping ultimate power in British hands. And these experiments would shape the choices made after independence, when India would create the world's largest democracy, a parliamentary system for a subcontinent of extraordinary diversity. The early 20th century brought new questions, new challenges to the models that had seemed settled. The Russian Revolution of 1917 offered a radically different vision, a system based not on constitutional democracy, but on the dictatorship of the proletariat, a one-party state that claimed to represent the workers and peasants, that rejected separation of powers and checks and balances as bourgeois illusions. This Soviet model would spread, would be adopted or imposed across vast territories, and for decades the world would be divided between competing visions of governance, between liberal democracies with their emphasis on individual rights and competitive elections, and communist states with their emphasis on collective ownership and centralized planning. And between these poles, many variations, social democracies in Scandinavia combining market economies with extensive welfare states and strong parliamentary systems, developmental states in East Asia, where governments actively guided economic growth while limiting political competition, populist movements in Latin America experimenting with different ways of organizing popular participation and controlling elite power. The interwar period saw democracy falter in many places, the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany, authoritarian governments across much of Eastern and Southern Europe, and observers worried that perhaps democracy was a luxury that only wealthy, stable societies could afford, that nations facing economic crisis or external threats would inevitably turn to strongmen. But the Second World War and its aftermath seemed to settle the question differently. The defeat of fascism, the discrediting of racial authoritarianism, and a new wave of constitution-making as colonies gained independence and defeated nations were rebuilt, Germany and Japan remaking themselves as democracies under occupation, India and dozens of African nations choosing democratic constitutions as they achieved sovereignty. Yet the Cold War meant that every constitutional choice had geopolitical implications. Every debate about governmental systems was shadowed by the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, between capitalism and communism, between liberal democracy and socialist planning, and nations found themselves pressured to choose sides, to adopt models associated with one bloc or the other. The newly independent nations faced particular challenges: artificial borders drawn by colonial powers, ethnic and religious diversity that made national unity fragile, economies dependent on exporting raw materials, and they experimented with various approaches, some copying Westminster models, others trying presidential systems, still others attempting to forge indigenous alternatives that drew on traditional forms of leadership and consensus. Tanzania under Julius Nyerere developed Ujamaa, African socialism based on village communities, one-party democracy that claimed to achieve unity without oppression, and many other African leaders followed similar paths, arguing that multi-party competition was a Western import, unsuited to African conditions, that development required unity and discipline rather than the luxury of opposition. But these experiments often produced disappointment, one-party states that became vehicles for corruption and personal rule, economies that stagnated under central planning, and gradually the consensus shifted. The idea grew that democracy and development were not opposed but complementary, that accountability and competition could strengthen rather than weaken nations. I can feel the weight of all these experiments, all these different paths taken, some leading to stability and prosperity, others to conflict and poverty, and the challenge of understanding why some systems flourish in some contexts while failing in others, why institutions that work brilliantly in one setting produce disaster in another. The room around me seems filled with ghostly parliaments, with chambers and assemblies from every continent, each one representing particular choices about how to organize collective life. And in the gathering darkness, I sense that we are approaching the moment when all these accumulated experiences, all these varied experiments would converge into new questions, new challenges that the old framework struggled to address. The turning point came in the final decades of the 20th century, a cascade of changes that transformed the landscape of comparative government, and the most dramatic shift began in Southern Europe in the 1970s, When Portugal and Spain and Greece emerged from decades of authoritarian rule, these transitions were called the third wave of democratization. The first wave having been the age of revolutions in the late 18th and 19th centuries, the second wave following the Allied victories in the world wars, and now this third wave washing across regions that many had written off as culturally unsuited to democracy. Portugal moved first. A revolution of carnations in 1974, soldiers placing flowers in their rifle barrels as they overthrew a dictatorship that had lasted nearly half a century, and the transition was messy, involved radical movements and counter-movements, but ultimately produced a stable parliamentary democracy, a constitution that guaranteed rights and created institutions for peaceful competition. Spain followed, navigating the delicate passage from Franco's death to constitutional monarchy. King Juan Carlos playing a crucial role, using his authority to support democratic reform rather than preserve authoritarian power, and the crafting of regional autonomy arrangements that gave Catalonia and the Basque Country significant self-government while preserving national unity. These Southern European transitions became templates, demonstrated that democracy could be built through negotiation and compromise, that authoritarian elites could be persuaded to accept new rules if given sufficient guarantees, and scholars studying these cases developed theories about how transitions happen, about the importance of pacts between reformers and moderates, about sequencing of elections and constitutional reforms. Then came Latin America, where military dictatorships that had seemed permanent began to crumble. Argentina after the Falklands War, Brazil through a gradual opening, Chile after Pinochet accepted a referendum on his rule and lost, and each transition involved particular bargains, particular institutional choices about how to deal with the past, whether to prosecute military officers for human rights abuses or grant amnesties in the name of reconciliation. And these transitions revealed new questions for comparative government, not just how to design stable democratic institutions, but how to build them in societies traumatized by repression, how to establish civilian control over militaries that had ruled directly, how to create trust in democratic procedures among populations that had learned to expect violence and arbitrary power. The 1980s brought changes in Asia as well. South Korea moving toward democracy after decades of authoritarian development. Taiwan beginning its slow transition from one-party rule, the Philippines rising up against Marcos, and each of these cases involved different dynamics, different configurations of social forces and institutional legacies. South Korea's democratization was driven partly by a growing middle class, educated citizens demanding political rights to match their economic achievements, and this seemed to confirm theories about modernization, about economic development, creating pressures for political opening. But other cases complicated the picture. Singapore and China achieving rapid growth while maintaining authoritarian control, suggesting that the relationship between development and democracy was contingent rather than automatic. Then came 1989, the year the world shifted on its axis, the Berlin Wall falling, communist regimes across Eastern Europe collapsing in the space of months, peaceful revolutions in Prague and Budapest and Warsaw, violent overthrow in Romania, and suddenly dozens of nations faced the challenge of building democratic institutions from scratch. These post-communist transitions were different from earlier waves because they involved not just political change but wholesale economic transformation, moving from command economies to markets while simultaneously building democratic institutions. And the dual transition proved extraordinarily difficult, required creating property rights and regulatory frameworks and tax systems and central banks, all while writing constitutions and holding elections and establishing rule of law. Some nations managed the transition relatively smoothly, Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic moving towards stable parliamentary democracies and market economies, eventually joining the European Union, adopting its standards and benefiting from its support. But others struggled, Russia lurching through economic chaos and political conflict, oligarchs capturing state resources, democratic forms persisting but hollowed out by corruption and concentrated power, and Central Asia and the Caucasus, where communist collapse led not to democracy but to new forms of authoritarianism, leaders from the old party apparatus reinventing themselves as presidents for life, creating hybrid regimes that held elections but ensured the outcomes, that had constitutions but ignored them when convenient. Comparative government as a field had to grapple with these hybrid regimes, systems that combined elements of democracy and authoritarianism in complex ways, competitive authoritarian regimes where opposition existed but faced systematic disadvantages, electoral autocracies that used the forms of democracy to legitimize fundamentally undemocratic rule. Scholars developed new typologies, tried to map the space between clear democracy and clear dictatorship, created measures of democracy that could capture gradations, and debates raged about whether these hybrid systems represented transitions toward full democracy or stable equilibria, or even disguised paths toward full authoritarianism. The late 20th century also saw important innovations in democratic design, new solutions to old problems. New Zealand, abandoning its Westminster first-past-the-post system for proportional representation, seeking to better represent minority views and force coalition building, and this change was studied closely by other nations considering electoral reform. South Africa faced perhaps the most daunting transition of all, emerging from apartheid with deep racial divisions and a history of systematic oppression, and the negotiated settlement produced a remarkably inclusive constitution with strong protections for minority rights, a constitutional court empowered to strike down laws, and provisions for power sharing during the initial transition period. The South African case raised profound questions about constitutional design in deeply divided societies, about whether democracy required majority rule or whether divided societies needed different arrangements, consociational systems with guaranteed representation for different groups, power-sharing executives, minority vetoes on crucial issues, Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Lebanon, all experimented with various forms of power sharing, trying to prevent majority groups from dominating minorities, trying to give all communities a stake in the system. But these arrangements also created problems, sometimes leading to deadlock, sometimes entrenching ethnic divisions rather than transcending them. The European Union itself became a fascinating case study, a supranational organization that combined elements of federal and confederal systems, with some powers pooled at the European level and others retained by member states, with a directly elected parliament, but also a council representing national governments, and the question of whether this represented the future of governance or a unique historical anomaly occupied many minds. As the 21st century opened, comparative government faced new challenges. Globalization meant that national governments were increasingly constrained by international markets, and institutions could not simply choose whatever policies they preferred without considering how capital and labor and goods would flow in response. And technology was transforming the possibilities of governance. The Internet creating new forms of communication and mobilization, social media enabling both democratic activism and authoritarian surveillance. And the question arose whether the institutions designed in the 18th and 19th centuries could handle the pace of change in the 21st. The global financial crisis of 2008 shook confidence in democratic governance, as elected governments seemed unable to prevent or adequately respond to economic catastrophe, and populist movements arose in many democracies, challenging established parties and institutions, claiming that elites had rigged the system, demanding more direct forms of popular sovereignty. Some nations experimented with participatory budgeting, letting citizens directly decide how to allocate portions of public spending with citizen assemblies, randomly selected groups deliberating on complex policy questions, with digital platforms for consultation and feedback, trying to supplement representative institutions with more direct forms of engagement, but others moved in authoritarian directions. Turkey and Hungary and Poland seeing democratic backsliding, elected leaders undermining checks and balances, capturing courts and media, restricting civil society. And this raised troubling questions about whether democracy was as secure as it had seemed, whether the third wave might be followed by a reverse wave. China's rise complicated the picture further. A one-party authoritarian state achieving remarkable economic growth and technological advancement, building infrastructure and reducing poverty, projecting power globally, and some observers wondered whether the Chinese model represented a viable alternative to liberal democracy, whether authoritarianism enhanced by technology could outperform messy democratic systems. But others pointed to the brittleness of authoritarian regimes, their inability to peacefully transfer power, their tendency to make catastrophic mistakes because they lack mechanisms for correction and accountability, and the debate over regime types took on new urgency, new stakes in a multipolar world. The study of comparative government had evolved enormously, from Aristotle's classification of constitutions to sophisticated quantitative analysis using global data sets, from philosophical speculation about ideal forms to careful empirical study of how institutions actually function, from focus on formal rules to attention to informal practices and political culture. Scholars now examined not just constitutions but political parties and electoral systems, bureaucracies and courts, federalism and decentralization, civil-military relations and mechanisms of accountability, trying to understand the complex interactions between formal institutions and informal norms, between structures and agency, between inherited constraints and present choices. And they recognized that there was no single best system, no one-size-fits-all solution, that presidential systems worked well in some contexts and poorly in others, that parliamentary systems had their own strengths and weaknesses, that federalism solved some problems while creating new ones, that every institutional choice involved trade-offs. The field had become both more humble and more sophisticated, less confident in universal prescriptions, more attentive to context and path dependence, more aware that building effective governance required not just good design but patient institution building, development of trust and norms, and habits of cooperation. I can feel the accumulated weight of all these experiences, all these transitions and experiments, all these hopes realized and disappointed, and the chamber around me seems to pulse with the knowledge that governance is never finished, that every generation must renew and adapt the institutions it inherits, must balance continuity and change, must find ways to address new challenges while preserving what works. The darkness outside is complete now, the windows showing only reflections of the dim interior, and in this enclosed space I sense that we have traced a long arc from ancient city-states to modern supranational unions, from rule by kings to government by consent, from systems that evolved organically to institutions deliberately designed, and through it all, the constant human effort to organize collective life in ways that balance order and freedom, stability and responsiveness, the interests of majorities and the rights of minorities. And yet, beneath all the institutional variations, beneath the differences between presidential and parliamentary systems, between federal and unitary states, between proportional representation and winner-take-all, there runs a deeper current, a set of questions that every system must somehow answer. The first question is about legitimacy, about why people obey, why they accept the authority of laws they did not personally consent to, why they pay taxes to governments they may have voted against, and different systems ground their legitimacy in different sources, some in divine right, some in tradition, some in the consent of the governed, some in their claim to represent historical necessity or the will of the people. But legitimacy is fragile. It must be renewed in each generation. And this is perhaps what comparative government reveals most clearly, that institutions endure only as long as enough people believe in them, only as long as they deliver outcomes that citizens find acceptable, only as long as they maintain at least minimal fairness and competence. The second question concerns representation, how the many can be governed while still having some voice in their own governance. And this question has no perfect answer, only different imperfect solutions. Elections that let citizens choose leaders but cannot capture the full complexity of public opinion. Parliaments that represent geographic districts but may not reflect other important identities. Parties that aggregate interests but also simplify and distort them. Some systems try to represent everyone proportionally, ensuring that each significant view has seats in the legislature, while others privilege geographic representation, giving voice to local communities and territorial diversity. And still others incorporate functional representation, seats for workers or farmers or religious groups, trying to ensure that particular interests are heard, but representation always involves both inclusion and exclusion, decisions about who counts as a citizen, who gets to vote, who can run for office, and these boundaries have shifted over time from male property owners to universal suffrage, from exclusion based on race or religion to formal equality, though informal barriers often persist even after formal ones fall. The third question is about power, how to create governments strong enough to function, to maintain order and provide public goods and defend against threats, while preventing them from becoming oppressive, And this tension between effectiveness and restraint runs through every constitutional design, every debate about executive authority and legislative oversight, every question about judicial review and administrative discretion. Federalism is one answer, dividing power between levels of government so that no single authority controls everything. But federalism creates coordination problems, questions about which level should handle which responsibilities, conflicts between national standards and local variation, and the balance must be constantly renegotiated as circumstances change. Separation of powers is another answer, creating multiple institutions that must cooperate to act, that can check each other's ambitions. But this too has costs, the possibility of gridlock, the difficulty of fixing responsibility when power is dispersed, the risk that stalemate will breed frustration and cynicism. And there are deeper patterns that comparative study reveals, the way institutions shape incentives, creating rules that make cooperation more or less likely, that reward moderation or extremism, that encourage leaders to build broad coalitions or mobilize narrow bases, that foster compromise or confrontation. Parliamentary systems with proportional representation tend to produce multi-party systems and coalition governments, requiring negotiation and power sharing, forcing parties to work together across ideological lines. While presidential systems with majoritarian elections often produce two-party competition, clearer accountability perhaps, but also winner-take-all politics and sharper polarization. Yet these tendencies are not deterministic. Culture and history matter too. The informal norms that fill the gaps in written rules, the habits of trust or suspicion that shape how conflicts are resolved, the reservoir of legitimacy that institutions can draw on when facing challenges, and these intangibles are harder to measure, harder to transfer from one context to another. The study of comparative government teaches humility, teaches that there are no perfect systems, only systems that work reasonably well for particular peoples in particular times, and that even the best designed institutions can fail if underlying conditions deteriorate, if inequality becomes too extreme, if social trust erodes, if external shocks overwhelm adaptive capacity. But it also teaches hope, because it shows that governance is not fixed, that nations can learn from each other, can borrow successful innovations and avoid costly mistakes, that constitutional design matters, that thoughtful institutional reform can improve outcomes, that the human project of self-government, difficult as it is, remains possible. I think of all the constitutions written and rewritten, all the experiments attempted, all the careful thought invested in trying to create systems that work, and I feel a kind of reverence for this ongoing effort, this refusal to accept that governance must be imposed from above, this insistence that ordinary people can collectively shape their own political lives. And I think of the countless individuals whose names are forgotten, but whose actions made democracy possible, the protesters who faced tanks and tear gas, the judges who ruled against powerful interests, the legislators who crafted compromises, the citizens who simply voted and paid taxes and served on juries, performing the mundane acts that keep self-government functioning. Comparative government is ultimately about choice, about recognizing that political arrangements are human creations, not natural facts, and that different choices produce different results, that we can do better by learning from experience, both our own and others. That observation and analysis and careful thought can help us build institutions worthy of the name. The chamber where I stand feels timeless now, as if it exists outside any particular moment, holding within it all the parliaments and congresses that have ever met, all the constitutions ever written, all the debates about how people should govern themselves. And in this timeless space, I sense the continuity of the human political project. The way each generation inherits institutions from the past and passes them, changed or unchanged, to the future. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson, that government is not a problem to be solved once and for all, but an ongoing practice, a set of habits and arrangements that must be maintained, adapted, renewed, that requires vigilance and participation, compromise and principle, the willingness to engage with those we disagree with, and the courage to stand firm on fundamental values. The work is never finished, the perfect constitution never written, the ideal balance never struck, because circumstances change and new challenges arise, and what worked yesterday may fail tomorrow. But this does not mean the effort is futile, only that it must continue, that each generation must take up the task anew. I can feel my thoughts beginning to settle, like sediment drifting down through clear water, and the urgency of comparison gives way to something quieter, a simple appreciation for the fact that human beings have tried so many ways, have thought so deeply, have cared so much about getting governance right. The light in the chamber has faded to almost nothing, just the faintest glow from sources I cannot identify. And in this near darkness, the physical details recede, the wooden benches and carved symbols becoming shadows, and what remains is the essential thing, the human desire to live under rule of law rather than arbitrary power, to have some voice in the decisions that affect our lives, to create order without sacrificing freedom. And I realize that every system we have examined, every constitution written, and every institution created represents an answer to this desire, imperfect perhaps, compromised by circumstances and human limitations, but genuine nonetheless, a sincere attempt to realize the possibility of self-government. The comparative study reveals not winners and losers, but a family of attempts, presidential and parliamentary, federal and unitary, majoritarian and proportional, each with virtues and vices, each suited to particular contexts. And the richness lies not in finding the one true system, but in understanding the full range of possibilities, the different ways that human communities have organized their collective lives. I let my gaze drift once more around the chamber, taking in the whole space, and I imagine it filled not with ghosts, but with potential, with all the future constitutions yet to be written, all the innovations yet to be tried, all the wisdom yet to be gained from careful observation and comparison. Because the story of comparative government does not end, it continues in every nation wrestling with how to organize itself, in every constitutional convention and reform commission, in every citizen trying to understand why their government works the way it does and how it might work better. And in this continuing story, we are all participants, not just passive observers, because governance depends on us, on our willingness to engage, to learn, to take seriously the task of collective self-rule, to study what has worked elsewhere and think carefully about what might work here. The silence in the chamber is profound now, a silence that feels full rather than empty, pregnant with all that has been and all that might be. And I stand in this silence feeling grateful, grateful for the accumulated wisdom of centuries, grateful for the courage of those who have fought for self-government, grateful for the patient work of building institutions that serve human dignity and freedom. My breathing has slowed to match the rhythm of this space, deep and even, and I notice that my mind has grown very quiet, the flood of facts and dates and names receding, leaving only the essential understanding that government is a human art, practiced differently in different places, but always aiming at the same fundamental goals: order and justice, stability and change, the welfare of the community and the rights of individuals. And as I stand here in the gathering stillness, I feel the weight lifting, the burden of all that information settling into something lighter, into simple awareness, that we have choices about how to organize our political lives, that these choices matter, and that by studying how others have chosen, by comparing systems and learning from successes and failures, we can choose more wisely. The room itself seems to be fading now, the walls becoming less distinct, the boundaries between inside and outside softening, and I am left with just the essential feeling, a sense of wonder at the human capacity for political creation, at the ingenuity and care invested in designing systems of governance, at the possibility that ordinary people can come together and craft rules for their common life. And this wonder is quiet, not excited or urgent, but peaceful, the kind of feeling that comes late at night, when thinking about something vast and important, when the details matter less than the overall pattern, when understanding deepens into something wordless. I notice that I am no longer actively thinking, no longer analyzing or comparing, just being present with this awareness, this knowledge that has settled into my bones, that governance is both universal and particular, that every human community must somehow organize itself, but that the ways of organizing are wonderfully various, each one reflecting particular histories and hopes and fears. And in this peaceful awareness, I feel the story completing itself, feel that we have traveled from ancient Athens to the present, from the first systematic comparisons to the sophisticated analysis of today. And through it all, we have seen the same human struggle, the attempt to create order without tyranny, to permit freedom without chaos, to balance competing goods that cannot all be perfectly realized. The chamber is barely visible now, more felt than seen, and even that feeling is fading, dissolving into simple restfulness, into the satisfaction of having traced a long arc, having held in mind the vast sweep of human political experience, and now letting it settle, letting it become part of the background, quiet knowledge that shapes understanding without demanding attention. And I stand in this fading space, this room that is now more idea than place, and I feel complete, feel that the journey through comparative government has reached its natural end, not because there is nothing more to say, but because what needs to be said, has been offered into the quiet, and now can rest. The last traces of the chamber dissolve, the amber light and wooden benches, the carved symbols and tall windows, all receding into darkness, and I am left in stillness, in the peace of completed thought, in the gentle awareness that hovers between waking and something else, something quieter, deeper, more restful, and in this deepening quiet the story ends, not with conclusion, but with fading, with thoughts becoming softer, more diffuse, until there is only the faintest awareness, barely a whisper, and then, even that, gently releases.